Close your eyes. There is a woman kneeling at the edge of a river in the darkness. It is 6,000 years ago. The water in front of her is not blue. It is brown, heavy with silt, moving with the quiet authority of something that does not need your permission to exist. She is not thinking about civilization. She does not have that word. She is thinking about the clay beneath her hands, wet and cold, and about the wall her community started building 3 days ago, and about whether the river will hold its course through the season or do what it did 2 years before, when it shifted without warning and buried the eastern fields under 4 feet of mud. She stays at the edge of the water for a long time, reading it the way her mother taught her, and her mother's mother before that. Then she stands up and walks back to tell the others what she found. What the people who lived beside this river built, over the next 4,000 years, became the foundation of many of the basic habits of civilization that still shape daily life today. The idea of written law, the concept of time divided into 60 seconds and 60 minutes, the first libraries, the first schools, the first love poem ever set down by a human hand. It began here, in the mud, beside a river that had no interest in being remembered. Settle in. Let the room go quiet. The woman is still walking back to tell the others. Chapter 1. The Land Between Two Rivers. Begin with a question that sounds simple until you stay with it long enough to feel what it is actually asking. Why here? The world in 4000 BCE was not empty. Forests covered enormous stretches of Europe. The Nile Valley in Egypt was already producing settlements of real complexity. The Indus River, in what is now Pakistan, was beginning to support communities that would eventually rival anything in the ancient world. Human beings had been solving the problem of survival for tens of thousands of years before anyone built a city in the flat, hot, flood-prone land that the ancient Greeks would one day call Mesopotamia. A word, meaning, simply, the land between two rivers. So why did one of the earliest urban civilizations appear here, in this particular place, and not somewhere gentler, somewhere with more trees and more stone and more predictable water? The answer is not what most people expect. It is not that this land was especially generous. It is that this land was especially demanding, and the demands it made on the people who chose to stay beside it forced them, generation by generation, to build structures of cooperation that no other environment in the ancient world required quite so urgently or quite so completely. The two rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates. They both rise in the highlands of what is now eastern Turkey, fed by snowmelt from the mountains of Anatolia and the Zagros range. They run roughly parallel for much of their length before converging in what is now southern Iraq and emptying together into the Persian Gulf. Between them and around them lies a broad, alluvial plain, flat and immense, built up over millions of years from the sediment those rivers have been carrying down from the mountains. That sediment is the beginning of everything. The silt, deposited by annual flooding, created some of the most fertile soil on Earth. In a good year, the land between the rivers could produce grain yields that would seem almost impossible to a farmer working the thin soils of the Mediterranean hills. Barley, in particular, thrived in conditions that would defeat almost any other crop. Communities that learned to manage the floods and direct the water onto their fields could generate surpluses far beyond what they needed to survive. And surplus is the precondition for everything that comes next. For craft specialization, for trade, for the accumulation of wealth, for the class of people who do not need to farm because other people's farming produces enough to feed them too. But here is what the textbooks tend to skip past. The flooding was not reliable. That is the detail that changes everything. The Nile, by contrast, flooded on a schedule so consistent that Egyptian farmers could build their entire agricultural calendar around it. The Nile's annual flood was, within a predictable range, a gift. The Tigris and Euphrates were something else entirely. Their floods came in spring, fed by snowmelt. But the timing varied. The volume varied. A mild year might leave fields thirsting for water. A heavy year might send walls of brown water across the plain with almost no warning, erasing weeks of labor, drowning livestock, collapsing the mud-brick walls of settlements that had taken years to build. Ancient Mesopotamian texts describe floods with a specificity that tells you these were not abstract dangers. They were immediate, personal, and recurring. The rivers could be read, in the way that the woman at the edge of the water in our opening was reading them. But they could not be fully predicted, and they could not be individually managed. No single farming family, however skilled and however diligent, could build the levees and irrigation channels and water distribution systems that the land required. The scale of cooperation needed to live beside these rivers safely was larger than any family and larger than most villages. This is the key that unlocks the entire subsequent story. To farm successfully in southern Mesopotamia, you needed your neighbors. Not occasionally. Not in emergencies only. You needed them structurally, as a permanent and non-negotiable condition of survival. The communities that could coordinate across distances, that could organize labor from multiple settlements toward shared infrastructure, that could maintain those systems year after year through drought and flood and conflict. Those communities survived and grew. The communities that could not were buried under silt and forgotten. The organizational capacity that managed the rivers also managed everything else: grain storage, trade networks, defense, the distribution of resources in years when the flood came too high or too low. Each of these problems required the same underlying infrastructure: the ability to coordinate the behavior of large numbers of people toward shared goals. Now consider what this land lacked, because the absences matter just as much as what was present. Southern Mesopotamia had almost no stone. The buildings you could construct from mud brick were serviceable but not permanent. A mud brick wall, unmaintained, dissolves back into the earth within a few generations. Without stone, there was no easy way to build the kind of monumental architecture that other ancient civilizations used to express permanence and power. There was almost no timber. The great cedar forests of Lebanon were hundreds of miles to the northwest. The date palm was everywhere in Mesopotamia and deeply important to the local economy. But palm wood is not structural timber. You cannot build a roof that spans a large room with palm trunks. There was no metal ore, copper, tin, the materials that would eventually allow for bronze tools and weapons. All of it had to come from elsewhere, from the mountains of Anatolia or Iran, from trading partners across routes that required maintenance and trust. Think about what this means for a moment. A civilization that lacked stone, timber, and metal could not be self-sufficient. From a very early point, the communities of southern Mesopotamia needed to trade with the outside world to obtain the raw materials that their own environment could not provide. And to trade, you needed surpluses worth exchanging. And to generate surpluses reliably, you needed the agricultural infrastructure that only large-scale cooperation could build. The poverty of the land in certain resources was not a limitation on civilization. It was one of its engines. It forced outward connection. It forced the development of trade networks that eventually stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean coast and deep into Central Asia. The merchants of Mesopotamia were not trading because they were adventurous by temperament. They were trading because they had no choice. Geography also shaped the direction of threat. To the east, the Zagros Mountains formed a barrier that was not impenetrable, but was significant. Behind those mountains lay the Iranian plateau, and the people who lived there would enter Mesopotamian history repeatedly, sometimes as traders, sometimes as conquerors, sometimes as both simultaneously. To the north and northwest, the land gradually rose toward the hills of what is now Syria and Turkey, where rainfall agriculture was possible without irrigation. The people of those hills looked down at the rich, flat land of the south with the specific attention that comes from living close to something valuable. To the south and east, the Persian Gulf opened onto sea routes that connected Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley civilization and to the trading networks of the Arabian Peninsula. And to the west, the Syrian desert formed a natural boundary that shaped where people moved and where they did not. This geographic frame meant that Mesopotamia was not isolated. It was a crossroads, a point of convergence for people and goods and ideas moving between the mountains of the north, the sea to the south, and the distant civilizations to the east and west. That constant traffic of people and materials brought new technologies, new practices, new pressures, and new opportunities at a rate that more isolated environments could not match. Now, step back even further and consider the timescale. Human beings had been living in and around the Mesopotamian region for tens of thousands of years before anything we would recognize as civilization appeared there. The earliest settlements in the area date to perhaps 10,000 BCE or earlier. Small communities of people who were farming and herding in the hills around the edges of the flat alluvial plain. The plain itself, with its flooding rivers and its demanding conditions, was not the first place people settled. It was a later frontier, a place people moved into as their numbers grew and as their organizational capacity developed to the point where they could actually manage what the environment demanded of them. The transition from small farming villages to the first true urban centers took thousands of years. It was not a single invention or a single moment of inspiration. It was the accumulated result of countless small decisions made by people who were simply trying to manage the specific problems in front of them. Decisions about how to share water rights, about where to build a communal grain storage facility, about which families would contribute labor to maintain the levee in the dry season, about how to resolve disputes between communities that depended on the same irrigation channel. Each of those decisions left a trace. Some traces were physical, channels dug and walls built that shaped what the next generation could do. Some traces were institutional, arrangements for cooperation that, once established, became the baseline from which the next level of organization was built. The historian Karl Wittfogel argued in the middle of the 20th century that the demands of large-scale water management were the primary driver of the centralized, bureaucratic states of the ancient world. His specific formulation has been refined and in some cases challenged by subsequent scholarship, and the relationship between water control and state formation is now understood as more complex and reciprocal than his original model suggested. But his core observation points at something real. In the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, the state did not build the irrigation system. The need for irrigation built the state. And the person who understood the rivers, who could read the signs of an incoming flood and calculate where the levees needed, reinforcing and coordinate the labor of enough people to do something about it before the water rose. That person held a form of authority that was simultaneously practical and almost sacred. In a world where the river could destroy everything, understanding the river was the closest thing available to power over forces beyond ordinary human reach. Remember that thought. It will matter in almost every chapter that follows. By around 5,500 BCE, something was beginning to shift in the settlements of southern Mesopotamia. Villages were becoming larger. The evidence from archaeological sites shows increasing social differentiation. Some households accumulating more goods than others. Some individuals being buried with objects that speak to status and specialization. Communal structures. The large buildings that seem to have served religious and administrative functions were becoming more elaborate. The specific people who lived through this transition did not know they were building civilization. They were managing a river. They were storing grain against the next bad year. They were negotiating with neighboring settlements about water rights. They were performing the rituals that they believed kept the unpredictable forces of their world from turning entirely hostile. But the cumulative effect of those practical decisions, repeated and refined across generations, was the slow emergence of a kind of social complexity the region had not seen before. The land between two rivers was not a paradise. It was a problem, stated with brutal clarity in flood season and whispered in the dry months when the channels needed constant maintenance to keep water moving to the fields. The civilization that grew here grew because people found ways to solve that problem together, year after year, century after century, in the only way the problem could be solved, with each other. That is where everything else begins. Chapter 2. The Ubaid and the Uruk world. Start with an image that takes a moment to fully land. A temple built, then filled with earth, then built again on top of itself. Generation after generation. The platform rising higher above the flat plain over centuries until the house of the god floats above the human world like something that belongs to a different order of existence entirely. That is not a metaphor for how the Ubaid culture worked. That is literally what they did. And the choice to honor what came before by building on top of it rather than tearing it down tells you something essential about how the first urban culture of Mesopotamia understood the relationship between the living and the dead, between the present and the past, between what has been given and what remains to be built. The culture archaeologists call the Ubaid, named after a site in southern Iraq where its distinctive pottery was first identified, flourished roughly between 6,500 and 3,800 BCE. Those are not dates to memorize. They are a span of time to feel. 2,700 years. Longer than the entire period from the birth of Christ to the present day. Longer than the Roman Empire lasted, and the Byzantine Empire after it, combined. The Ubaid people left no written records, because writing had not yet been invented. They left no royal inscriptions, no epic poetry, no law codes. What they left were settlements, pottery, tools, and the physical evidence of a way of organizing collective life that proved so successful it spread across an enormous geographic area without, as far as the archaeological record shows, any military conquest driving it. This last point deserves attention. The Ubaid style of pottery, the Ubaid style of temple architecture, the Ubaid approach to organizing a settlement, spread from southern Mesopotamia north through the Tigris and Euphrates valleys, east into the Zagros foothills, and south along the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. Archaeologists have found Ubaid-style materials at sites hundreds of miles from the southern Mesopotamian heartland, and the evidence does not suggest that this spread was driven by armies or by the forced displacement of existing populations. It appears to have been driven by the attractiveness of a particular way of doing things. The Ubaid communities had developed an approach to agricultural management, to communal storage, to the organization of labor around shared infrastructure. That worked well enough in the demanding conditions of Mesopotamia that neighboring communities adopted it. They saw something that solved problems they recognized, and they took it up. This is how most cultural transmission actually works. Not through conquest, but through the quiet acknowledgement that someone else has found a better answer to a problem you share. At the center of Ubaid settlement, life was the temple, not a grand structure by later standards, but a distinctive one, The Ubaid temples were built on raised platforms, oriented along specific axes, with a long central hall flanked by smaller rooms. They were larger and more carefully constructed than the residential buildings around them. They required organized labor to build and organized resources to maintain. The temple was not only a religious building in the modern sense of that phrase, it was also an administrative center, a storage facility, a point of redistribution for communal resources. The archaeological evidence from Ubaid sites suggests that the temple institution managed grain storage, organized craft production, and coordinated the maintenance of irrigation infrastructure. The religious and the administrative were not separate spheres. They were aspects of a single function, the management of collective survival, performed by people whose authority was grounded in their relationship to the divine. The person who understood the gods, in this worldview, was also the person best qualified to manage the grain. Now, around 4000 BCE, something changed. Changed is too mild a word. Something accelerated. In the settlement that would become the most important city in the ancient world for the next several centuries. Its name was Uruk. And what happened there, in the period archaeologists call the Uruk expansion, roughly between 4000 and 3100 BCE, was among the earliest urban revolutions in human history. Uruk grew. That sentence does not capture what actually happened. Uruk grew into a scale of human settlement that had rarely, if ever, existed before anywhere on Earth. By around 3300 BCE, Uruk covered an area of roughly 2 square miles and housed a population that scholarly estimates, much necessarily approximate given the evidence available, place somewhere between 20,000 and 40,000 people. The uncertainty in those numbers is genuine and worth acknowledging. Archaeological estimates of ancient city populations involve significant assumptions about residential density and site occupation patterns that different researchers weigh differently. What is not in dispute is the order of magnitude. For context, the largest settlements in Europe at this time were villages of a few hundred people. Uruk was a different category of human settlement entirely. Think about what it actually means to have tens of thousands of people living in one place in 3300 BCE. Every one of those people needed to eat every day. None of them could grow their own food within the city limits. The agricultural hinterland around Uruk had to be organized intensively enough to feed a non-farming urban population of enormous size, which required irrigation systems, labor coordination, and distribution networks operating at a scale that had never been attempted before. Every one of those people needed somewhere to sleep, which required construction of residential buildings at a pace and density that demanded organized planning, standardized materials, and specialized labor. The city needed craftspeople who did nothing but make pottery, or weave textiles, or work metal, which meant those people were not farming, which meant the agricultural surplus supporting the city had to be large enough to feed not just the population, but the portion of the population that was producing goods rather than food. The city needed administrators, people whose entire function was to track what was coming in, what was going out, who owed what to whom, which labor obligations had been fulfilled and which had not. And the city needed a way to record all of that information, because no human memory, however exceptional, can reliably track the transactions of tens of thousands of people. This is the environment in which writing was born, not in a moment of creative inspiration, in the grinding daily necessity of managing a city too large for any other system to handle. The physical evidence from Uruk itself reflects the scale of what was happening. Archaeologists excavating the site found temple complexes of extraordinary ambition for their period. The White Temple, built on a raised platform called a ziggurat. He was constructed from whitewashed mud, brick, and oriented to align with astronomical features in a way that suggests considerable accumulated knowledge of the sky. The Anna district of the city contained multiple large public buildings arranged around a central space in a configuration that speaks to civic planning, the deliberate organization of urban space for collective use. The stone cylinder seals that appear in the Uruk period for the first time are another window into what was happening. These small carved cylinders, rolled across wet clay to leave an impression, were used to mark ownership and authenticate transactions. They show images of the so-called priest-king figure, a bearded man performing ritual functions, hunting, overseeing labor, presenting offerings. This figure appears so consistently across Uruk period imagery that scholars believe he represents an actual institutional role, the leader of the city whose authority was simultaneously religious, administrative, and symbolic. He is not yet a king in the later Mesopotamian sense. He does not yet have a personal name in the record, but he is the prototype of something, a figure whose authority extends across the full range of collective life, whose legitimacy is grounded in his connection to the divine, and whose practical function is the management of a community too large and too complex to manage itself. The Uruk expansion also extended outward from the city itself. Archaeological sites across a wide area of the ancient Near East show evidence of Uruk-style materials, Uruk-style administrative tools, and Uruk-style temple architecture appearing at existing settlements or at newly founded outposts during this period. Some of these outposts appear to have been trading colonies, established to secure access to the raw materials that southern Mesopotamia so conspicuously lacked. Timber from the north, metal ore from the mountains, stone from wherever it could be obtained. The Uruk world was not an empire in the later sense. There is no evidence of a centralized political authority projecting military power across this network. It was more like a cultural and commercial gravity field, with Uruk at the center, pulling in resources and radiating out the organizational technologies that made it possible to manage the scale of activity it had created. Then, around 3100 BCE, the Uruk expansion contracted. The distant outposts were abandoned, the trade networks disrupted or reorganized. Exactly what happened is a matter of ongoing scholarly discussion. Climate shifts, internal political changes, resistance from communities that had initially accommodated the Uruk presence but eventually found it unwelcome. Possibly all of these things contributed. But Uruk itself survived, and what it had created during the centuries of its expansion did not disappear when the expansion ended. The organizational technologies, the administrative practices, the template for urban life persisted and spread and were taken up by the successor cultures that followed. The most important of those technologies was the one that made all the others recordable, transferable, and cumulative in a way that oral tradition alone could never achieve. The city that had grown too large for human memory to manage had, in the process of managing itself, invented the means to extend human memory indefinitely. It had invented writing, and the world was never quite the same kind of place again. Chapter 3. The Invention of Writing. Picture a room lit by oil lamps in a city of tens of thousands of people. A man sits at a low table. In front of him is a lump of wet clay, a reed cut at an angle, and a tablet already covered in marks from yesterday's work. He is not a priest. He is not a warrior. He is not the kind of person that later civilizations would build monuments to. He is an accountant, and he is about to do something that no one before him has ever done in quite the same way. He is going to write down a number. Not because anyone told him this was historic, Because the city outside his window has more grain moving through its storage facilities than any human mind can reliably track. And someone has to keep the count accurate, or people go hungry. Here is the thing that almost every popular account of writing gets wrong. The first writing was not literature. It was not poetry or prayer, or the recording of great deeds for future generations. It was not even the telling of stories, which human beings had been doing for tens of thousands of years, before anyone pressed a mark into a clay tablet. The first writing was accounting. Specifically, it was the recording of grain allocations and textile production and labor obligations in the administrative machinery of late Uruk period, Mesopotamia. The earliest written documents we have, dating to around 3300 BCE and found at the site of Uruk itself, are lists. Quantities of barley received, numbers of animals counted, allocations of rations to workers, the identifying marks of the institutions and individuals involved in these transactions. They are, if you approach them with the wrong expectations, extraordinarily boring documents. They are also, if you understand what they represent, among the most consequential objects ever produced by a human hand. To understand why, you need to think about what memory actually is, and what it can and cannot do. Human memory is remarkable. The oral traditions of pre-literate cultures demonstrate that human beings can memorize and transmit with great accuracy texts of enormous length and complexity. The Homeric epics, the Vedic hymns, the genealogies of Pacific Island navigators who needed to remember every island and every current across thousands of miles of open ocean. Oral culture is not primitive culture. It is a different, and in many ways, extraordinarily sophisticated relationship with knowledge. But oral memory has limits that become critical at a specific scale of social complexity. You can remember, with practice and effort, the debts and obligations of your village. You can remember who owns which field and who owes labor service to whom and which family received grain from the communal store during the last drought, and how much. Memory stretched and trained by necessity can hold a remarkable amount of this kind of information. You cannot reliably remember the transactions of tens of thousands of people across multiple years of economic activity. The number of individual records required simply exceeds what human memory can hold with the precision that economic administration requires. A memory error in recalling a debt is not merely an intellectual mistake. It is a practical injustice that can destabilize the relationships of trust on which the entire system depends. The administrative apparatus of late Uruk, Mesopotamia, had developed a partial solution to this problem before writing appeared. Clay tokens of various shapes, spheres, cornice, cylinders, discs, had been used across the ancient Near East for thousands of years to represent specific quantities of specific goods. A sphere might represent a certain measure of grain. A cone might represent a jar of oil. Collections of these tokens, sealed inside hollow clay balls called bullae, constituted a kind of proto-record of transactions. The system worked, but it had limitations. The clay ball had to be broken open to verify its contents, which destroyed the record, and the system could only represent things for which tokens existed, which constrained the range of information it could capture. At some point in the late 4th millennium BCE, the transition happened. Instead of putting the tokens inside the clay, someone pressed the shapes of the tokens into the outside of the clay, an impression of a sphere instead of the sphere itself, a mark instead of the object. The record was now the surface rather than the container. It could be read without being destroyed. And once the principle was established that a mark on a surface could stand in for a physical object, the next step, using marks to stand in for words and sounds rather than just things, became at least conceivable, even if it took centuries to fully develop. The earliest Sumerian writing system uses two basic types of signs: pictographs, simplified images of the things they represent, and numerals, marks indicating quantities. The pictographs were not attempts at realistic depiction. They were functional symbols, the minimum visual information needed to identify the referent unambiguously, designed to be pressed quickly into wet clay with a stylus, which in practice meant they were angular and simplified. The corners and straight lines that a reed stylus produces most efficiently, rather than the curves a brush or pen would naturally make. This is why the mature cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped writing system that developed from these early pictographs and remained in use for roughly 3,000 years, looks the way it does. The wedge shapes are not an artistic choice. They are the artifact of a specific technology, a cut reed pressed into clay at specific angles, optimized over generations for speed and legibility. The transition from pictographic writing to a system capable of representing the full range of spoken language took several centuries and involved several key innovations, each one expanding the range of things that writing could capture. The most important of these was the rebus principle, the insight that a sign originally representing a thing can be repurposed to represent the sound of the word for that thing, regardless of meaning. Once writing can capture sound, it can, in principle, represent anything that can be said, not just the nouns and quantities of an accounting system, but verbs, adjectives, abstract concepts, proper names, the full complexity of human thought expressed in language. This transition is documented in the archaeological record over the course of the early 3rd millennium BCE. The writing that emerges from this process is not yet the cuneiform script of the great literary texts. It is still primarily administrative, but its range is expanding. It can now record names. It can record actions. It can record relationships between people and institutions that go beyond simple quantity. Among the earliest named individuals preserved in the written record is a person referred to as Kushim, whose name appears on an accounting tablet from around 3000 BCE, recording transactions in barley. Scholars often cite Kushim as an example of one of the earliest named individuals known from writing, while noting that questions remain about whether Kushim designates a specific person or an institutional role, and that the interpretation of these very early records involves genuine scholarly debate. What is clear is that the written record did not begin with the voices of the powerful. It began with the voices of the people who made the system run. Now consider what the invention of writing actually changed, at a level deeper than the practical convenience of better record keeping. Before writing, human knowledge was limited by the capacity of human memory and the range of human voice. Knowledge that was not remembered was lost. Knowledge that could not be transmitted across the distance a person could travel was difficult to share. Each generation had to relearn much of what the previous generation had learned, because the transmission was imperfect and the storage medium, living human beings, was fragile and mortal. Writing changed the relationship between knowledge and time. A clay tablet pressed in 3000 BCE and buried under the ruins of a Mesopotamian city could be read, given the right expertise, 5,000 years later. The knowledge it contained did not fade with the memory of the person who wrote it. It did not depend on an unbroken chain of teachers and students to survive. It could lie in the ground for millennia and still speak when someone found it and knew how to listen. This is not merely a practical improvement in information storage. It is a transformation in what kind of entity a civilization is. A civilization with writing is a civilization that can accumulate knowledge across generations in a way that a civilization without writing cannot. Each generation does not start from zero. It starts from the written record of everything that came before, which it can critique and extend and build upon, rather than merely remember and repeat. The scribal schools that developed in Mesopotamia to train the people who would use and produce this written record were among the earliest educational institutions in human history. We have curriculum documents from these schools, lists of the exercises students were required to master, progressions from simple sign lists to complex literary texts. We have student tablets with corrections marked by teachers. We have, in a few remarkable cases, texts that appear to record actual classroom exchanges, students complaining about the difficulty of the work, teachers explaining why the difficulty was necessary. The students who passed through these schools were being trained not only in a technical skill, but in a way of organizing thought. To write clearly is to think clearly about what you are trying to say. To read carefully is to engage with the organized thoughts of someone who is not present, perhaps someone who lived generations before you. The texts produced by that civilization, once writing had developed to the point where it could capture the full range of human experience, included administrative records and legal documents and commercial contracts, but also hymns and laments and wisdom literature and medical texts and astronomical observations and mathematical problems, and eventually, the story of a king who traveled to the ends of the earth looking for immortality and came back carrying something harder than eternal life, the knowledge that it did not exist. That story was pressed into clay tablets in the city of Nineveh, in the library of a king who had conquered most of the known world, and it lay buried under the ruins of that library for over 2,000 years. In the 1870s, a scholar named George Smith, working in the British Museum on a collection of excavated tablets from that library, was reading a text that stopped him. The tablet in his hands described a great flood, survivors on a boat, birds sent out to find dry land. The parallels to the Genesis narrative were unmistakable. By later accounts, Smith was so deeply shaken by the recognition of what he was holding that he could not remain calm. He had found what is widely regarded as one of the oldest surviving long narratives known to scholarship, a story whose echoes had been reverberating through religious tradition for millennia without anyone in the modern world knowing where it had originated. That moment of recognition, a 19th century scholar reading the thoughts of an ancient scribe across thousands of years of silence, is one of the clearest illustrations of what writing actually is. It is a technology for crossing time. The woman at the edge of the river, in our opening, could not send a message to us directly. Her thoughts, her fears, her understanding of the water she was reading, died with her and with everyone who remembered her. But the scribes who came after her, who learned to press their thoughts into clay and fire it hard enough to survive the collapse of the cities that contained it, those people can still speak to us, across 5,000 years of distance, in a script that had to be painstakingly decoded by modern scholars. They can still make themselves understood. That is not a trivial thing. That is among the most significant technologies the human mind has ever produced. And it was born in the administrative offices of a city that needed to count its grain more reliably than human memory allowed. In the mud, beside the river. Chapter 4. Sumer city states, guards, and the first kings. Walk into any major city in ancient Sumer and look for the tallest thing on the horizon. It will not be a palace. It will not be a wall. It will be a temple platform rising above the flat rooftops of the city around it. Its whitewashed mud brick catching the light in a way that makes it visible from miles across the plain. The temple is at the center of everything, not because the people of this city are unusually pious in some abstract way, though they are devout in the specific, practical way of people who believe that the forces governing their survival have personalities and preferences and can be negotiated with, but because, in the Sumerian worldview, the temple is not a place where humans go to speak to the gods. It is the house where the god actually lives. The city does not belong to its king. The city belongs to its god. The king is, at most, a steward, a capable manager entrusted with running the estate of a divine owner who is always present, always watching, and always capable of withdrawing favor if the management is poor. This is not metaphor. This is the operating premise of Sumerian political and religious life. And understanding it changes how you read everything else about this civilization. Let me show you what this looked like in 3 cities. In the city of Ur, a harbor town near the mouth of the Euphrates, the patron god was Nana, the moon god. The temple complex there was not simply a place of worship, it was a functioning estate, with storage rooms packed with textiles and grain and precious metals, with workshops where craftspeople produced goods in the god's name, with kitchens where offerings were prepared as actual meals for a divine resident who was understood to be genuinely present. The priests who managed this estate were not performing empty ritual, they were running, in the most literal sense, the household of someone they believed was there. In Nippur, a city in the center of the Sumerian heartland, the patron was Enlil, lord of wind and storms. Nippur was not the most powerful city militarily, and it was not the wealthiest commercially, but it was the most religiously central. To control Nippur was to control the city that all of Sumer recognized as the dwelling place of the god whose blessing made any other ruler's authority legitimate. Kings from across the region sent offerings to Nippur not because they were forced to, but because being seen to honor Enlil was the Sumerian equivalent of being recognized by the highest authority in the world. And in Uruk, whose size and commercial power we have already encountered, the primary deity in the later Sumerian period was Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose personality was so vivid and so complex and so willing to act on her own desires, regardless of the consequences, that she generated more hymns, more stories, and more theological argument than almost any other figure in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Inanna was not a gentle or predictable goddess. She was powerful and volatile and deeply compelling, a divine reflection of the city she patronized, beautiful and fierce and impossible to ignore. Each of these cities was, in theological terms, a divine household, and the person who managed that household, in the early Sumerian period, was not called a king. The earliest Sumerian term for the ruler of a city is En, a word that carries connotations of both religious and administrative leadership. The En was the person responsible for maintaining the god's household, ensuring that the rituals were properly performed, that the agricultural calendar was correctly observed, that the irrigation infrastructure was maintained, and that the god's estate was managed with sufficient competence to guarantee continued divine favor. The En was not a king in the later sense. The authority was understood as delegated, not inherent. The En managed on behalf of the god. The god owned everything. This distinction mattered enormously in practice, because it placed a constraint on the kind of authority a ruler could legitimately claim. A ruler who behaved as though the city belonged to him personally rather than to the god was, by definition, a bad manager. The tradition of criticizing rulers for exactly this kind of overreach runs through Mesopotamian political thought from the earliest records to the latest. Now, the Sumer that emerges into the historical record in the early 3rd millennium BCE was not a unified state. It was an ecosystem of competing city-states, each with its own patron deity, its own ruling institution, its own dialect of Sumerian, and its own fierce sense of its own importance and independence. The competition between these cities was not purely military. It was theological, commercial, and cultural simultaneously. The border conflict between Lagash and its neighbor Umma illustrates this with unusual clarity. The dispute was over a fertile agricultural district called the Guedana, a stretch of land lying between the two cities that both claimed by right of divine grant. The conflict was not new. Texts from Lagash describe the dispute going back generations, each side appealing to its patron deity for vindication, each side accusing the other of violating boundary markers that the gods themselves had established. What makes this conflict historically significant is not its drama, though it had genuine drama, but its documentation. The ruler of Lagash named Eannatum, who ruled around 2450 BCE, commissioned a monument known today as the Stela of the Vultures to commemorate his military victory over Umma. This carved stone monument shows, on one face, the god Ningirsu holding a net full of defeated enemies. On the other face, Eannatum himself leads the army of Lagash in a phalanx formation. Soldiers, with shields and spears, moving in disciplined ranks. The Stele of the Vultures is among the earliest surviving representations of organized military force in the archaeological record. It shows that by the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, Sumerian city-states had developed not just administrative and religious institutions, but also the military institutions that made sustained competition between states possible. That military capacity was expensive. Equipping soldiers, maintaining weapons and chariots, feeding and organizing the labor of building defensive walls. All of this required resources beyond what a purely agricultural economy could easily generate. The pressure of intercity competition drove institutional development in a self-reinforcing cycle. Cities that could not organize their resources efficiently enough to maintain competitive military capacity were absorbed or destroyed by cities that could. Cities that survived the competition grew more administratively sophisticated in the process. The king, as a concept distinct from the earlier or steward figure, emerges in this context of sustained military competition. The Sumerian King List, a document compiled in the late 3rd millennium BCE and surviving in multiple copies, presents a history of kingship in Sumer that begins before the flood and traces the succession of dominant cities across hundreds of generations. The early portions of the King List, with individual reigns measured in thousands of years, are clearly legendary in their specific details. Though scholars, including Thorkild Jacobson, have argued that the underlying structure reflects genuine historical memory of a period when different cities held primacy in succession. The political reality the King List reflects is the phenomenon scholars call hegemony, the recognition by other cities of one city's temporary primacy, not empire, not direct control, something closer to acknowledged precedence. The right to convene assemblies, to arbitrate disputes, to lead coalitions in war, and to receive the symbolic acknowledgement of superiority from rulers who in practice remained largely autonomous. This is the political world that Gilgamesh inhabited. But, before we follow him, stay for a moment with the ordinary texture of Sumerian city life. The streets of a city like Ur were narrow and winding, lined with mud brick houses whose blank outer walls presented no windows to the street. Life was turned inward, organized around a central courtyard open to the sky, where cooking, weaving, and the daily maintenance of domestic life took place. The markets were loud and varied. Merchants traded textiles, the single most important export commodity of Sumer, dried fish, dates, the caloric staple that the date palm produced in quantities that anchored the diet of most of the population, and beer, the daily beverage of Sumer, brewed from barley in quantities that the administrative records track with the same careful attention given to any other important commodity. The goddess Ninkasi, whose hymn doubles as a detailed recipe for beer production, was one of the more practically important deities in the Sumerian pantheon, which tells you something about what the Sumerians considered worth honoring. The taverns where beer was sold were run primarily by women. The legal texts of the period regulate the conduct of female tavern keepers with a specificity that tells you both how common such establishments were and how significant their role in daily life was considered to be. And then there was the temple complex, dominating the skyline, its ziggurat platform rising above everything else, the visible center of a world in which the divine and the human were not separate spheres, but deeply and practically intertwined. Among the priestesses who served the temple were women of remarkable authority and visibility. The high priestess of the moon god Nana at Ur, a position sometimes held by the daughter of the ruling king, left behind a body of hymns attributed to a woman named Enheduanna, who lived around 2200 BCE. Enheduanna is among the earliest named authors whose works have survived anywhere in the world. She did not merely transcribe temple ritual, she wrote with a personal voice, with the specific emotional intensity of someone whose relationship to the goddess she served was genuinely transformative. Her hymns to Inanna described the goddess with an immediacy and a complexity that centuries of later tradition would struggle to match. She wrote about being driven from her position by a political rival. She wrote about her own suffering with a directness that formal conventions might have been expected to suppress. She wrote, unmistakably, as a person. Among the earliest surviving authored works in human history is a woman writing about a goddess in a city that understood its entire existence as the management of a divine estate. That is Sumer. Complicated, hierarchical, intensely practical in its religion, organized around the management of scarcity and the production of surplus, capable of violence and capable of beauty, building its temples higher and higher above the plain. The kings, who would eventually claim authority over all of it, were learning. In the border wars and the hegemonic competitions and the slow accumulation of administrative sophistication, what kingship actually required. One of them learned it better than anyone before him, and the story that grew up around his learning became one of the oldest surviving stories in the world. Chapter 5. Gilgamesh and what myth preserves. There is a king in the ancient city of Uruk who will not stop building, not a modest defensive structure, a wall of immense ambition, a circuit of fired brick enclosing the entire city, 6 miles in circumference, with towers at regular intervals. Its construction requiring the organized labor of a substantial portion of the city's population over a period of years. When it is finished, it will be one of the most impressive structures in the ancient world. The people of Uruk are exhausted. The king has driven them hard. He has conscripted their sons for his building projects and his military campaigns. He is brilliant and physically extraordinary. And he is, at this point in his story, deeply unpleasant to live under. His name is Gilgamesh. He likely ruled the city of Uruk sometime in the early part of the 3rd millennium BCE, though the specific dates are uncertain. Scholars, including Andrew George, who produced what many consider the most authoritative modern translation of the epic, treat the historical Gilgamesh as a real person around whom an enormous body of legend accumulated over the centuries following his reign. The Sumerian king list places him as the 5th king of the 1st dynasty of Uruk after the flood, with a reign length that signals legendary rather than historical status. The Epic of Gilgamesh that survives is not a single text produced at a single moment. It is the product of more than 1,000 years of literary development, beginning with separate Sumerian stories composed sometime in the late 3rd millennium BCE, and reaching its most complete form in what scholars call the Standard Babylonian version, compiled by a scholar-scribe named Sine Leki Unnini somewhere around the 12th or 11th century BCE. This standard version is what the tablets from Ashurbanipal's library at Nineveh preserve. The tablets that George Smith recognized in the British Museum with such force that he was reportedly deeply shaken by the discovery. The fact that a story about a Sumerian king was being copied, revised, and expanded for over 1,000 years before reaching its most complete form tells you something important about what the story was doing for the cultures that kept returning to it. Stories do not survive that long through institutional inertia. They survive because each generation finds in them something that speaks to questions the generation cannot stop asking. The questions that Gilgamesh asks are not obscure. He asks why the people he loves die. He asks what the point is of building things that will eventually fall. He asks whether there is any way to escape the fate that waits for every human being regardless of their power or their accomplishments. He asks, with the specific anguish of someone who thought his greatness might exempt him from the rules that apply to ordinary people, whether greatness is worth anything at all if death cancels it. These are not ancient questions. They are the questions, and the Epic of Gilgamesh is among the oldest surviving records of a human being working through them in a sustained and serious way. At the beginning of his story, Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a formulation that the ancient text offers without explanation and that modern readers sometimes stumble over. The point is that Gilgamesh is closer to the divine than any ordinary human being, and yet he is still mortal. He still has a human mother, the goddess Ninsun, whose presence in the story is one of its most quietly moving elements. A mother watching her exceptional and difficult son and loving him with the specific grief of someone who can see where his nature is taking him. The city of Uruk, under Gilgamesh's governance, sends a complaint to the gods. The gods respond by creating a counterpart to Gilgamesh, a wild man named Enkidu, formed from clay and raised among the animals of the steppe, who does not know what it means to be human and has never seen a city. The creation of Enkidu is one of the great narrative strokes of ancient literature, because Enkidu is not created as an enemy for Gilgamesh to defeat. He is created as a companion, someone equal to Gilgamesh in strength and vitality, but opposite to him in origin and experience, as a way of completing something in Gilgamesh that his greatness and his isolation have left unfinished. The process by which Enkidu is brought into human civilization is itself remarkable. A woman introduces him to human food and drink and the pleasures of human company. When he first eats bread and drinks beer, the text says that his face shone. He becomes human through the act of sharing what human beings share with each other. The wild man is not domesticated by force, but by hospitality and connection. When Enkidu and Gilgamesh finally meet, they become friends with an intensity that the text describes in terms usually reserved in Mesopotamian literature for romantic love. Enkidu becomes the thing that Gilgamesh's position had prevented him from having: a genuine equal, someone who could tell him the truth, someone whose regard was not shaped by fear or calculation. The friendship changes Gilgamesh, not immediately, not completely, but in the direction of someone more capable of genuine connection with the people he governs. Together, Gilgamesh and Enkidu travel to the cedar forest, a distant and dangerous realm guarded by a terrifying monster named Humbaba, whom Enlil has appointed as protector of the forest. They defeat Humbaba and return to Uruk in triumph. Then the goddess Ishtar, The Babylonian counterpart of Inanna, proposes to Gilgamesh. He refuses her, and he refuses her in terms that are, by any standard of diplomatic communication, extraordinarily tactless. He lists her previous lovers and the fates they came to. He is not wrong about the facts. He is spectacularly wrong about whether this is the moment to cite them. Ishtar's response leads to another battle, another victory. And then Enkidu has a dream, telling him that the gods have decided one of the two friends must die as payment for what has been taken. It is not Gilgamesh who dies. It is Enkidu. The death of Enkidu is the pivot point of the entire epic. Everything before it is the story of a great man becoming greater. Everything after it is the story of a great man learning what greatness is actually worth. Gilgamesh mourns Enkidu with an extravagance that his city finds difficult to live with. He mourns not only the loss of his friend, but the knowledge that friend's death has forced on him. The knowledge that he himself will die. He has always known this in the abstract. He knows it now, in the specific, embodied way, that only the loss of someone you love can teach you. He leaves Uruk. He wanders the wilderness, wearing animal skins, looking for something he cannot name precisely, but that the story understands very well. He is looking for immortality. He is looking for the thing that will make the death of Enkidu and his own eventual death meaningless, or reversibly, or at least comprehensible. His journey takes him to the edge of the known world, through the tunnel beneath the mountains where the sun travels at night, to the waters of death, to the island of the only human being who has ever been granted eternal life by the gods. His name is Utnapishtim, and the story he tells Gilgamesh is one you may recognize. The gods decided to destroy humanity with a great flood. Utnapishtim was warned by the god Ea, who passed the information through a reed wall in a way that technically did not violate the divine council's secrecy. Utnapishtim built a great boat. He loaded it with his family, the craftsmen of his city, and every living creature. The flood came and destroyed everything else. When the waters receded, the boat grounded on a mountain. Birds were sent out to find land. The survivors came ashore, made offerings, and the gods granted Utnapishtim and his wife eternal life. Take a moment with that story. You have almost certainly heard a version of it before. The relationship between the Mesopotamian flood tradition and the biblical narrative of Noah is complex and still actively debated among scholars. What is generally accepted is that both draw on a very ancient tradition rooted in the Mesopotamian world, and that the biblical narrative, as we have it, reflects awareness of, or possible contact with, these older Mesopotamian versions during the period of the Babylonian exile. Though the specific channels of transmission and the theological transformations involved remain subjects of genuine scholarly discussion, the direction of borrowing, the timing, and the meaning of the differences between the versions are questions that careful historians continue to work through. What matters for the story we are following is what Utnapishtim's flood tells Gilgamesh about his own situation. Eternal life was granted once, under extraordinary circumstances, and will not be granted again. The exception proved the rule rather than changing it. Gilgamesh is still mortal. There is a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea that will restore youth, if not eternal life. Gilgamesh dives for it, finds it, begins the journey home. A snake steals it while he sleeps. He returns to Uruk with nothing, except that this is not quite right, because the end of the standard Babylonian version of the epic does something that has struck readers across the centuries as both anticlimactic and, when you sit with it long enough, exactly right. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk. He looks at the walls he has built, and the text, in its final lines, invites the reader to look at those walls too, to walk along their circuit, to examine the fired brick of their construction, To understand, through the physical presence of what Gilgamesh built, that something of him persists. The wall is still there. Uruk is still there. The story is still there. Gilgamesh did not find immortality. He found something that functions like it. Not the immortality of the body, but the immortality of what you leave behind. The things you built, the stories told about you, the community that continues after you are gone. A king who understood only his own power was the Gilgamesh of the opening pages. Brilliant and terrible and exhausting to live under. A king who understood that his city outlasted him, that the wall he built would stand after he was gone, that the people whose sons he had conscripted were the same people whose memory would carry his name forward. That king had learned something that only the fully human experience of losing someone he loved had finally taught him. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a story about what it costs to become a good king. The cost is grief. The education is loss. And the final lesson is that the city, not the king, is the thing that endures. That lesson was pressed into clay thousands of years ago by people who had been watching kings rule their cities for generations and who understood, with the particular clarity of people who lived under the consequences of both good and bad governance, exactly what they wanted that lesson to say. They pressed it into clay so it would last. It lasted. It is still speaking. And the world it was speaking about was about to change in a way that no one inside it could fully see coming. Because while the city-states of Sumer were competing for hegemony and telling stories about their kings, something was assembling itself in the middle reaches of the river. Something that would do what no ruler before it had done. Something that would refuse to stop at the edge of the city-state and keep going. Chapter 6. Sargon of Akkad, the world's first empire builder. He had no father whose name could be recorded. That is where the story begins. And that is the detail that mattered most to everyone who told it afterward. His mother, the text says, was a priestess who could not keep him. She placed him in a basket of rushes, sealed it with bitumen to keep the water out, and set it on the current of the Euphrates. A man named Akkad, a drawer of water, found the basket, pulled it from the river, and raised the child as his own. The boy grew up working in the irrigation gardens along the river bank, until something in him caught the attention of the goddess Ishtar, and the attention of a king, who made him his cupbearer. That story was written down centuries after the events it describes. Whether it is literally true is not the most interesting question to ask about it. The more interesting question is what it was designed to say, and why a ruler of extraordinary power chose to present himself through the image of a child discarded on a river and lifted up by forces beyond ordinary human arrangement. The answer is that Sargon of Akkad had no legitimate claim to the throne by birth. He was not the son of a king. In a political world where legitimacy flowed primarily through lineage and divine appointment, a man without a recorded father had a problem. The birth narrative was the solution. If your origin was mysterious enough, if the circumstances of your beginning were sufficiently dramatic and touched by divine intervention, then the absence of a noble lineage became, paradoxically, a form of special election. The goddess had chosen him before he was old enough to choose anything himself. Sargon ruled from approximately 2330 BCE, though scholars working with different chronological frameworks, including what historians call the middle chronology and the short chronology, place this date somewhat differently. The uncertainty is genuine and worth acknowledging. What is not uncertain is the scale and the novelty of what he accomplished. He founded what ancient sources and modern scholars describe as a remarkably early example of a territorial empire, a political entity stretching from the Persian Gulf in the south to the upper reaches of the Euphrates in the north and west, encompassing territory that included dozens of previously independent city-states and multiple distinct linguistic and cultural communities. Before Sargon, the dominant political unit in Mesopotamia was the city-state. A powerful city might achieve hegemony over its neighbors, might extract tribute and acknowledgement of precedence, but it did not dissolve the independence of those neighbors into a single administrative structure. The conquered cities kept their own governments, their own temples, their own traditions. The relationship between a hegemonic city and its subordinates was more like a protection arrangement than a unified empire. Sargon did something different. He conquered, and then he stayed. He installed his own governors in the cities he defeated. He appointed his daughter, Enheduanna, the poet and priestess whose hymns we encountered in the previous chapter, as high priestess of the moon god Nanna at using a religious appointment as a mechanism of political integration, binding the most important religious institution of the south to the authority of the Akkadian court in the north, using his daughter's genuine spiritual authority, her real and recognized gifts as a poet and a religious figure, as an instrument of imperial administration. That is a sophisticated move. It is worth pausing on. Sargon understood that the most durable form of control was not the kind maintained by soldiers at city gates. It was the kind maintained by people who genuinely belonged to the institutions they were now asked to serve the empire through. He built a new capital city, Akkad, whose location has never been definitively identified by archaeologists, but which the texts describe as a significant center of power and commerce. He conducted military campaigns in every direction with a consistency and a scale that the Sumerian city-states had never experienced. Later texts describe campaigns reaching as far as Anatolia in the northwest and the cedar forests of Lebanon. Whether all of these campaigns happened exactly as described, or whether some represent later elaboration, is debated by scholars. But the core achievement, the political unification of much of Mesopotamia under a single authority for the first time in the region's history, is well attested in contemporary documents. The administrative challenge Sargon faced was genuinely unprecedented. How do you govern a territory this large, with this much linguistic and cultural diversity, through the administrative technologies available in the late 3rd millennium BCE? There were no rapid communication systems. A message from the capital to a distant governor traveled at the speed of a messenger on foot or on a donkey. There were no standing armies in the modern sense, able to project force quickly across long distances. The institutions of government had been designed for city-scale administration, not territorial empire. Sargon's solutions were improvised and imperfect, but they established patterns that later empires would refine and extend. He created a professional military force, soldiers who owed their loyalty and their livelihood directly to him rather than to any city or temple institution. Ancient texts describe this force as eating daily at his table, a detail that functions both as a literal description of a patronage system and as a symbolic statement about the personal relationship between the king and his military. To eat at someone's table in the ancient world was to be bound to them. The soldiers who ate at Sargon's table were his men in the deepest sense the culture understood. He worked to impose the Akkadian language as the language of administration across his empire. Sumerian did not disappear. It remained the language of religious ritual and literary tradition for centuries after Sargon. But Akkadian became the language of government, creating a common administrative medium across territories that had previously communicated in different languages. He standardized weights and measures, making commerce and taxation across the empire more legible from a central administrative perspective. And he constructed a mythology of royal power that was qualitatively different from anything that had come before. The Sumerian city-state ruler was a manager of a divine estate. Sargon positioned himself as something closer to the chosen instrument of the gods at a cosmic level. The inscriptions of the Akkadian period describe Sargon as beloved of Ishtar, as ruling with a mandate that was not merely local, but universal. This expansion of the royal self-image from city manager to universal sovereign was not merely rhetorical. It reflected a genuine change in the nature of the authority being claimed. A city manager could be replaced by another city manager if the god was displeased. A universal sovereign, chosen by the gods at a cosmic level, had a claim to authority that transcended any particular city or any particular divine household. The tension between these two models of legitimate authority, the manager who serves on behalf of something larger than himself, and the sovereign who embodies divine will directly, runs through Mesopotamian political thought from Sargon's time forward. Later rulers would navigate this tension in different ways. Most tried to balance both simultaneously. The practical strains of maintaining the empire were enormous. The texts from Sargon's reign, and those of his successors, describe constant military activity, campaigns to suppress revolts, punitive expeditions against cities that had attempted to reassert their independence. The conquered cities of Sumer had long and proud traditions of independence. Accepting the authority of a foreign king, whose capital was in the north, and whose language was not Sumerian, was not something they did willingly or permanently. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, pushed the imperial project further, and in doing so, illustrated both its possibilities and its dangers. Naram-Sin took the extraordinary step of declaring himself a god, adding the divine determinative to his name in official inscriptions, an act that no previous Mesopotamian ruler had claimed during his own lifetime. He titled himself King of the Four Quarters of the Universe, a formulation that claimed dominion over everything the Mesopotamian geographical imagination could conceive. The victory stele of Naram-Sin, which survives and is now in the Louvre in Paris, shows him ascending a mountain in triumph. His divine status, marked by the horned helmet worn only by gods, enemies falling beneath his feet. It is one of the most confident images of royal power in the ancient world, and it contains, if you look at it long enough, something that feels like a warning. A man who has decided that the constraints of human status no longer apply to him. A man who has stopped being able to see the difference between what he has achieved and what he actually is. Ancient Mesopotamian tradition remembered Naram-Sin with precisely that ambivalence. His military achievements were acknowledged, but the tradition also preserved stories of him ignoring omens that counseled against certain actions and paying catastrophic prices for his overconfidence. The message was consistent across the centuries that kept retelling his story. The king who forgot that his authority was delegated, who confused his own power for divine power rather than divinely sanctioned power, had committed the fundamental error of Mesopotamian political theology. The Akkadian Empire collapsed sometime around 2150 BCE. The causes have been debated for generations. Internal revolt clearly played a role. The Gutians, a people from the Zagros Mountains, invaded from the east and disrupted the political order. But research by Harvey Weiss at Yale and others examining climate and sediment data for this period has pointed to another factor that the ancient texts themselves describe: a prolonged drought and dust event affecting the northern agricultural regions that may have undermined the economic foundations of Akkadian power more thoroughly than any military enemy could. The ancient literary text, known as the Curse of Akkad, describes the destruction of Sargon's capital in terms of divine punishment for Naram-Sin's impiety. Whether the climate evidence supports a connection between environmental stress and the empire's collapse, and how much weight to give the ancient literary interpretation versus modern scientific analysis, are questions that scholars continue to work through. The collapse was probably multi-causal, with military, political, and environmental factors interacting in ways that made each one more damaging than it would have been alone. But the legacy of the Akkadian Empire outlasted the empire itself by several millennia. Sargon became, in Mesopotamian tradition, the archetypal empire builder, the model against whom every subsequent ruler who dreamed of universal dominion measured himself. His name was invoked by later kings, who wanted to connect their own ambitions to the greatest precedent the tradition offered. Stories about him multiplied and elaborated across the centuries. The man who came from the river, who had no father, whose name could be recorded, who built something the world had not seen before, became a figure that the Mesopotamian imagination could not stop returning to. The questions his career raised were never fully answered by the tradition that remembered him. How do you maintain the loyalty of conquered peoples without destroying what made them distinctive? How do you build an administration large enough to govern an empire without creating a bureaucratic class whose interests eventually diverge from the rulers? How do you prevent the periphery from drifting away when the center is too distant to enforce its authority in real time? Every empire that came after Sargon wrestled with these same questions. None of them found a permanent solution. All of them found temporary ones that worked for a while and then stopped working. The man who came from the river had asked the questions that empire always asks of itself. The answers were still being worked out. They still are. And in the rubble left by the Akkadian collapse, rising from the south with a patient and methodical ambition that looked nothing like Sargon's dramatic reach for universal dominion, a new kind of state was assembling itself. One that was less interested in the poetry of conquest than in the machinery of administration. Less interested in how large it could become than in how precisely it could count what it already had. Its legacy would be measured not in monuments, but in tablets. Not in battles, but in records. And its obsession with documentation would produce one of the most complete pictures of daily life in any ancient civilization anywhere in the world. Chapter 7. The Third Dynasty of Bureaucracy as Civilization. Listen for a moment to what silence sounds like when it is filled with work. Not the silence of an empty room. The silence of a room where dozens of people are bent over clay tablets. Styluses moving with the focused efficiency of people who have been doing this since before sunrise. Who will continue until the light fails. Who understand that the work they are doing is the thing standing between their city and chaos. It is around 2050 BCE in the city of outside these walls. The fields are producing grain at a rate that would have seemed impossible to the farmers of 2 centuries ago, because the irrigation system has been extended and maintained with a precision that previous generations could not achieve. The warehouses at the edge of the city hold more barley than anyone living here has ever seen stored in one place. The harbour is busy. The roads out of the city are maintained and patrolled. None of this happens by accident. All of it is happening because of what the people in this room are doing. They are counting everything. The Third Dynasty of which ruled Mesopotamia from approximately 2112 to 2004 BCE, produced more surviving administrative documents than any other period in ancient Mesopotamian history. Scholars estimate that somewhere between 40,000 and 100,000 cuneiform tablets from this period have been excavated, purchased, or otherwise obtained by museums and collections around the world, with a significant additional number remaining unexcavated or unprocessed. Among those tablets is one recording the delivery of 42,611 fish to a storage facility. Not approximately 40,000 fish. Not roughly 40,000. 42,611. Each one counted. Recorded. attributed to a specific delivery, and entered into an administrative system that tracked not only what came in, but where it went, who received it, and whether the quantity matched the expectations established by prior planning documents. This document is not unusual. It is representative. A state that generates this volume of written records is a state that has made a specific and consequential choice about how it intends to govern. It has decided that the primary mechanism of control is not military force or religious authority alone, though it has both, but information, the ability to know, with precision, what every workshop is producing, what every worker is contributing, what every storage facility contains, what every official is doing with the resources entrusted to him. The dynasty was founded by a king named Ur-Namma, who came to power in the aftermath of the Gutian period that had followed the collapse of the Akkadian Empire. Ur-Namma emerged as the dominant figure from a period of reassertion by the southern Sumerian cities, eventually unifying the major urban centers of the region under his authority. What Ur-Namma built, and what his son Shulgi refined into its most elaborate form, was something distinct from both the earlier Sumerian city-state system and the Akkadian imperial model. It combined elements of both, while introducing administrative innovations that went beyond either. The religious legitimacy of the Ur-3 kings was carefully constructed. Ur-Namma presented himself as a pious restorer of proper order, a king who rebuilt temples, maintained canals, and governed according to the will of the gods. He promulgated what may be the earliest surviving law code in the historical record, a document known as the Laws of Ur-Namma, predating the more famous code of Hammurabi by roughly 3 centuries. The laws address matters of economic regulation, family relations, and the protection of weaker members of society from exploitation, with specific provisions for widows, orphans, and the poor. The existence of this law code is significant not primarily for its specific contents, which overlap considerably with later Mesopotamian legal traditions, but for what its promulgation says about how the Ur-3 kings understood the relationship between royal authority and social order. A king who issues written laws is making a specific claim that the social order of his realm rests on articulated rules that apply consistently. Whether the Ur-3 legal system actually delivered on this claim for all members of society is a separate question. The claim itself represented a model of governance with implications that ran well beyond its immediate practical application. Now come to Shulgi. Shulgi ruled for approximately 48 years, from around 2094 to 2047 BCE, and is the best documented individual ruler of the Ur-3 period. His reign saw the standardization of virtually every aspect of economic activity that the state could reach. Weights and measures were standardized across the empire with a precision that the surviving standard weights confirm archaeologically. The calendar was reformed and standardized, replacing the varying local calendars of different cities with a single administrative calendar used across the empire for the coordination of labor obligations, tax payments, and commodity deliveries. The cuneiform script itself was simplified and standardized, making it more consistent across different scribal schools and easier to train new scribes in quickly. The hymns, composed in Shulgi's honor at the scribal schools, are among the most elaborate examples of royal self-promotion in Mesopotamian literature. He claimed expertise in every art and every skill, from wrestling to music to navigation to scholarship. He boasted of running from Nippur to Ur and back in a single day as an act of athletic and religious devotion. Whether this literally happened is not the interesting question. The interesting question is what a king needed to claim about himself in order to project the authority appropriate to the ruler of an empire. And the answer the Ur-3 hymns give is that he needed to be not just militarily powerful, but comprehensively excellent. A person in whom every human virtue was present at its highest possible development. But behind the hymns, behind the royal self-promotion, there was a real administrative machine running. And it was run by people whose names appear in the tablets not as heroes, but as functionaries. Consider a man named Dumuzi Gamil. He is not famous. He did not commission monuments. He appears in the administrative record of the Ur-3 period as an overseer of a labor gang, one of the hundreds of mid-level administrators who kept the system functioning. His tablets record the daily output of the workers under his supervision, the grain allocated to feed them, the deductions made when workers fell short of their quotas, the credits recorded when they exceeded expectations. Dumuzi Gamil's world was made entirely of numbers. How many bricks laid today? How many workers present? How many absent due to sickness, and how many due to travel, and how many listed simply as gone? The tablet's quiet acknowledgement that some workers had left and not come back. In those small notations, in the gaps between the counted and the uncounted, you can feel the edges of a system that was more complete in its ambitions than in its reach. The Ur-3 state wanted to know everything. It could not quite manage everything, and the distance between those two facts is where the human story of the period actually lived. The labor system of the Ur-3 state is one of its most studied and most debated features. A substantial portion of the population was organized into labor gangs, groups of workers assigned to specific tasks, managed by overseers who recorded their output and reported to higher administrative officials. The state tracked their output with remarkable specificity. A standard daily labor quota existed for various tasks, and workers who did not meet the quota had the deficiency recorded against their account as a debt. The texts record not only the work performed, but the reasons for non-performance: sickness, travel, death, escape. That last category appears with a frequency that suggests the system was not universally popular with those it organized. The ration system that supported this labor force was equally carefully documented. Workers received standardized rations of barley and oil and sometimes other commodities. The amounts varied by category of worker, by gender, by age, and by skill level. Children received smaller rations than adults. Skilled workers received more than unskilled workers. And somewhere in those variation tables, in the careful calibration of who gets how much, you can see something that tells you as much about this civilization as any monument or law code. A state that thinks hard enough about food allocation to create detailed tables distinguishing the rations of different categories of workers has made a decision about how it values different kinds of human beings. Those decisions are not neutral. They are the architecture of a social order, built one tablet at a time, pressed into clay that was meant to dry and be stored and be referenced and be followed. The textile industry is particularly well documented. The Ur-3 state operated large weaving establishments, primarily staffed by women and children, producing standardized textiles in quantities measured in the tens of thousands of garments per year. These textiles were a primary export commodity. The administrative texts track the wool input, the number of workers, the daily production quotas, the output, and the distribution of the finished cloth with a completeness that allows modern researchers to reconstruct production rates and efficiency levels in considerable detail. The ambition of the Ur-3 state was to make the entire economic life of the empire legible to the central administration. The ambition was not entirely realized. No administrative system has ever achieved complete legibility of the economy it attempts to govern, and the Ur-3 system was no exception. Substantial economic activity continued to take place outside the state system, in private households, in local markets, in arrangements between individuals that never entered the official record. The strains that eventually brought the system down were multiple and interacting. The administrative costs of maintaining the surveillance and recording apparatus were themselves substantial. The rigidity of the standardized system made it difficult to adapt quickly to local conditions or unexpected events. From the outside, the Amorites, semi-nomadic people from the western steppe, whose presence along the borders of the empire had been a source of concern for generations, began pushing into the settled regions with increasing pressure. The administrative texts from the later years of the dynasty record the construction of a wall, evocatively called the wall that keeps the Amorites away, stretching across the landscape between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The dynasty ended with the reign of Ubaid, the last Ur-3 king, whose long and painful decline is documented in a remarkable series of letters and literary texts that convey something of what it felt like from the inside to watch an empire dissolve. The letters show a king struggling to maintain contact with distant governors who were increasingly acting on their own authority. Supply lines disrupted. Grain prices rising to catastrophic levels. Cities cutting their ties to the imperial center one by one as the center's ability to project authority faded. Ubaid was eventually captured by the Elamites from the mountains to the east and carried away to their homeland. The city of Ur was sacked. A lament was composed for its destruction, one of a genre of lament texts that describe the abandonment of Mesopotamian cities by their patron deities in terms of such specific grief that they read less like formal literary compositions than like eyewitness accounts of loss. The goddess Ningal, patron of Ur, is described pleading with the assembly of gods to spare her city. The gods do not listen. The city falls. The goddess weeps for what she could not prevent. The lament is not an accusation. It is not a demand for explanation. It is an attempt to make the destruction comprehensible by placing it within a framework in which even the gods are bound by forces larger than their individual will, in which catastrophe is not random, but is the outcome of a cosmic process that human beings and gods alike must navigate without full understanding. That framework, the attempt to find meaning in catastrophe rather than simply recording the catastrophe, is one of the things that distinguishes Mesopotamian literary tradition from mere chronicle. The third dynasty of Ur was gone. But the administrative templates it had developed, the standardized weights, the reformed calendar, the scribal training system, the very idea of managing a large territorial state through systematic documentation of economic activity, those things persisted. The successor states of the early 2nd millennium BCE inherited the institutional infrastructure of the Ur-3 system, even as they modified and adapted it to their own purposes. The 42,611 fish are still in the record. The state that counted them is long gone. What it built from counting them lasted much longer than anyone who pressed those numbers into clay could have anticipated. Now move south and west, across the centuries, to a city that would take all of this institutional inheritance and wrap it in something that the Ur-3 state, for all its sophistication, had never quite managed. A story about itself that the entire ancient world would find compelling. Chapter 8. Babylon Rising, Hammurabi, and the Idea of Law. In the Louvre, in Paris, a stone column stands 7.5 feet tall, carved from a single piece of black diorite, covered from top to bottom in carefully incised cuneiform text. At the top of the column, carved in relief above the text, two figures face each other. One is seated on a throne, wearing the horned crown of divinity, extending toward the standing figure what appears to be a rod and a ring, ancient Mesopotamian symbols of royal authority and divine measurement. The seated figure is the sun god, Shamash, god of justice. The standing figure, receiving the symbols of authority with his hand raised in a gesture of respectful attention, is a king. His name is Hammurabi. He ruled Babylon from approximately 1792 to 1750 BCE, and the text covering the rest of that column is the document that made his name the most recognizable in all of ancient Mesopotamian history. 282 laws covering everything from agricultural contracts to surgical malpractice to the proper conduct of tavern keepers. The image at the top of the column is doing careful and deliberate work. It is not showing Hammurabi writing the laws. It is showing him receiving the authority to promulgate them from the God of justice himself. The distinction matters enormously. Hammurabi is not presenting himself as the inventor of justice or as the source of law. He is presenting himself as the conduit through which divine justice enters the human world, the properly authorized human vessel for principles that originate at a level above any individual ruler. This framing is consistent with everything we have seen about Mesopotamian political theology. The king manages. The king implements. The king is chosen and empowered by forces larger than himself, and his authority derives from that appointment, not from his own will or his own power alone. Hammurabi came to power in Babylon when the city was a relatively minor player in the complex political landscape of early 2nd millennium Mesopotamia. The collapse of the Ur-III dynasty had fragmented the region into a collection of competing kingdoms, city-states, and tribal territories, each maneuvering for advantage in a political environment that rewarded flexibility, opportunism, and the careful cultivation of alliances. Hammurabi spent the first decades of his reign as a capable but unremarkable regional ruler, maintaining Babylon's position through diplomacy and selective military action. The letters he exchanged with the king of Mari during this period, which survive in that archive, show a ruler of considerable political intelligence, patient, observant, willing to wait for opportunities rather than forcing them. Then, in the later decades of his reign, he moved with a speed and decisiveness that his patient early years had not predicted. In a series of military campaigns conducted between approximately 1763 and 1755 BCE, Hammurabi defeated Larsa, defeated Eshnunna, defeated Mari, and unified most of Mesopotamia under Babylonian authority for the first time since the Akkadian Empire. He was in his 50s when he accomplished this. A man who had spent 30 years preparing and 10 years executing. The law code was promulgated toward the end of his reign, after the major conquests were complete, and its purpose was not primarily what modern readers tend to assume. The laws themselves are not a comprehensive legal code in the modern sense. They do not cover every possible legal situation. They are written in a casuistic format. If this happens, then that follows. A series of specific cases with specific outcomes that function more like precedents or exemplary judgments than like a systematic legal framework. Many of the situations they address were already covered by existing legal practice and custom. The laws of Ur-Namma had addressed similar issues 3 centuries earlier. The specific content of Hammurabi's laws was not revolutionary. What was significant was the act of collection and public promulgation. By inscribing these laws on a monument designed to be publicly visible, Hammurabi was making a specific political claim. He was saying that in his realm, the principles governing legal outcomes were known in advance, consistent across different cities and different populations, and backed by divine authority. He was positioning himself as the guarantor of a predictable legal order for the diverse populations his conquests had brought under Babylonian authority. Think about who those populations were. The cities Hammurabi had conquered had their own legal traditions. their own temple institutions, their own histories. Integrating them into a unified political system without constant military enforcement required something more subtle than force. It required the construction of a shared framework within which diverse communities could recognize the authority of the central power as legitimate rather than merely coercive. The law code was that framework, or rather, it was the visible symbol of that framework, the monument that anyone could point to as evidence that Babylonian authority rested on principles rather than merely on power. The prologue and epilogue of the code, which are literary compositions of considerable quality, make this political purpose explicit. Hammurabi describes himself as a shepherd of his people, as someone whose primary obligation is the protection of the weak from the strong, the widow and orphan from exploitation, the debtor from unconscionable creditors. The specific laws are windows into the social structure and the economic anxieties of early second millennium Babylonian society. The famous principle of eye for an eye, which appears in the code and which has shaped subsequent legal and ethical discussion for centuries, is not actually the dominant principle of the code as a whole. It applies primarily to injuries between people of equal social status. The code distinguishes carefully between three classes of persons: the free citizen, the dependent worker, and the slave. And the penalties for the same act vary considerably depending on the social status of both perpetrator and victim. This is not an accidental feature of the code. It is the explicit legal expression of a hierarchical social order, a codification of the principle that the same act has different significance depending on who commits it and who suffers it. The family law provisions illuminate gender relations and household structure in ways that other documents from the period rarely do. Women in Hammurabi's Babylon occupied a more varied legal position than a simple summary might suggest. Married women could own property in their own names. They could conduct commercial transactions. In certain circumstances, they could initiate divorce. At the same time, the code reflects a society in which men held primary authority in the household and in which the legal rights of women were significantly constrained compared to those of free men. The medical and surgical provisions have attracted attention for the fee schedules they establish and the penalties they impose. A physician who performs a successful operation on a free citizen receives a specific fee. A physician whose operation results in the patient's death has his hand cut off. The provision reflects the code's general principle that liability follows outcome, applied to a field where the stakes of failure are particularly high. Babylon, under Hammurabi and his successors, became something more than a political capital. It became a cultural center of the first order. The literary production of Old Babylonian period Mesopotamia is extraordinary. This is the period when the Epic of Gilgamesh was being compiled and revised into something approaching its mature form. This is the period when mathematical texts of remarkable sophistication were being produced in the scribal schools. Texts demonstrating knowledge of what is sometimes called the Pythagorean relationship, the connection between the sides of a right triangle. More than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. The important distinction to note here, as historians of mathematics including Eleanor Robson have emphasized, is that the Babylonians knew this relationship as a practical computational tool rather than as a geometric theorem proved from first principles in the way Greek mathematics would later formalize it. Both achievements are significant. They are simply different kinds of achievement, and collapsing the distinction does a disservice to both traditions. The scribal schools of Old Babylonian Mesopotamia trained administrators and priests and physicians and musicians, and in doing so they transmitted a cultural inheritance of staggering depth. A student in a Babylonian scribal school in 1700 BCE was learning texts that had been composed centuries before his birth, engaging with a literary and intellectual tradition that stretched back to the Sumerian period. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE. His successors maintained Babylonian dominance for another century and a half before the dynasty was ended in approximately 1595 BCE by a Hittite raid from Anatolia, a devastating military action that the Hittites did not follow up with occupation, withdrawing after their raid and leaving a political vacuum that was filled by a people arriving from a different direction entirely. The first Babylonian dynasty was over. But the city endured. The laws endured. The literary tradition endured. The stone column, with its 7.5 feet of carefully incised text, survived everything that followed, and ended up in Paris, where it has been standing in the Louvre since 1902. Still readable. Still speaking. The voice of a king who wanted the people of his realm to know that the principles governing their lives were written down and publicly available and backed by the authority of the sun god himself. Whether that claim fully delivered on its promise is the question every law code has to answer in practice rather than in stone. But the claim itself, that governance should rest on known and consistent rules rather than on the arbitrary will of the powerful, was one of the more consequential ideas the ancient world produced. It is still being argued over. In every courthouse and every legislature where someone asks whether the law serves justice or merely power, the argument that began on that column is still being had. Chapter 9. The Kassites, the Dark Age, and what survives collapse. There is a kind of work that history tends to forget because it does not announce itself, not the work of conquest, not the work of building monuments or promulgating laws or composing epics, something quieter and in its own way more demanding. The work of keeping things alive when the conditions for their survival have become uncertain. The work of the custodian, the copyist, the teacher who shows up and teaches even when the political world outside the school walls has become unrecognizable. The Kassite period of Babylonian history, running roughly from the 16th to the 12th century BCE, is full of this kind of work, and the temptation to skip past it, to move quickly from the drama of Hammurabi to the terror of Assyria, is understandable but mistaken, because what the Kassites did, and more importantly, how they did it, tells you something about the resilience of civilizations under stress that the more dramatic periods cannot teach quite as clearly. The Kassites were a people of uncertain origin. Their language is not clearly related to any other known language family, a fact that makes their pre-Mesopotamian history opaque in ways that scholarship has not yet resolved. They appear in Babylonian records before the collapse of the first Babylonian dynasty as workers, mercenaries, and settlers along the northern and eastern borders of the kingdom. They were not, initially, conquerors. They were people who had been present in and around Mesopotamia for generations before the circumstances that allowed them to take political control. Those circumstances were created by the Hittite raid that ended the first Babylonian dynasty around 1595 BCE, disrupting the existing political order severely enough that the Kassite leaders were able to move into the resulting vacuum. The transition from the first Babylonian dynasty to Kassite rule was not a dramatic military conquest of the type that Sargon or Hammurabi had conducted. It was more like a gradual assumption of authority in conditions of disorder. What is clear is that by around 1590 BCE, Kassite rulers were in control of Babylon, and that their rule is generally regarded by scholars as the longest single dynasty in Babylonian history, persisting for approximately 4 centuries. 4 centuries is a span of time that requires a moment to absorb. The United States has existed for less than 250 years. The entire period of Roman imperial history, from Augustus to the fall of the Western Empire, is roughly 500 years. The Kassites ruled Babylon for 4 centuries. And they ruled, as far as the evidence allows us to judge, without the spectacular military campaigns, the monumental building projects, and the elaborate self-promotion that characterized the dynasties on either side of them. This is not absence of activity. It is a different mode of governance. Picture a scribe in a Kassite period temple school in Babylon, sometime around 1300 BCE. He is copying a text that was composed more than 500 years before his birth. A hymn to the goddess Inanna, written by a woman named Enheduanna, who served in a city this scribe has never visited, in a political world that no longer exists. He does not know whether anyone will read his copy in a generation or a century or 1,000 years. He does not know that a scholar will eventually hold a version of this tradition in his hands in a building neither of them can imagine. He knows only that the text is worth preserving, that the tradition he has been trained to maintain is larger than any single political arrangement, larger than any dynasty, larger than the specific moment he happens to be living through. He keeps copying. This is the essential act of the Kassite period. Not conquest, not dramatic self-assertion, transmission. The Kassite kings were deliberate and sophisticated integrators. They did not attempt to replace Babylonian culture with their own. They adopted Babylonian religious traditions, presenting themselves as pious worshippers of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, whose temple they maintained and expanded. They used the Babylonian language for official and religious purposes. They commissioned literary and scholarly work in the Babylonian tradition, supporting the scribal schools that maintained and transmitted the intellectual heritage of earlier periods. In a world where conquest frequently meant the erosion or severe disruption of the conquered culture's traditions, the Kassite approach was distinctive. They understood, or came to understand through practice, that the value of Babylon was inseparable from the cultural infrastructure that made it Babylon, a city stripped of its temples, its scribal schools, its literary traditions, and its merchant networks was not worth ruling. The Kassites ruled a going concern by keeping it going. The international diplomatic record of the Kassite period is preserved, in remarkable completeness, in what are known as the Amarna letters, a collection of clay tablets found at the site of Akkad in Egypt in the late 19th century. Among these tablets are letters exchanged between the Egyptian court and the Kassite kings of Babylon. And these letters reveal a world of 2nd millennium BCE international relations whose sophistication is genuinely surprising. The great powers of the period, Egypt, Babylon, the Hittite kingdom, Assyria, and others, maintained formal diplomatic relationships that included regular exchanges of ambassadors, carefully negotiated royal marriages with substantial dowries recorded in detail, and exchanges of luxury goods that functioned simultaneously as expressions of royal generosity and as mechanisms of prestige competition. The letters address each other as brothers, a diplomatic term of art, establishing the theoretical equality of the parties, while simultaneously negotiating carefully about who owes what to whom. One letter from a Kassite king to the Egyptian pharaoh, written probably around 1350 BCE, complains with remarkable directness that the gold sent by the pharaoh in a previous exchange was insufficient, that when it was melted down, it proved to be of lower quality than represented, and that this was not the appropriate way for great kings to treat each other. The mixture of formal diplomatic courtesy and blunt commercial complaint in this letter captures something genuine about how international relations actually worked in this period, as a negotiation between parties who needed each other and knew it, conducted within a framework of elaborate ceremonial that both sides understood as functional theatre. The Kassite dynasty did not survive the late second millennium disruptions. Sometime around 1155 BCE, Babylonia was invaded by the Elamites from the mountains to the east, who sacked the city and effectively ended Kassite rule. The Kassites left behind no great literary monuments in their own name. They left no famous law code, no epic of conquest, no hymn to a Kassite king that has become part of the world's literary heritage. What they left was 4 centuries of maintained continuity. The texts that the scribal schools copied and preserved during the Kassite period included the works that subsequent centuries would treat as the canonical literary heritage of Mesopotamian civilization: the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation epic, the great collections of omens and divination texts, the mathematical and astronomical treatises, the medical texts. All of these were copied, preserved, and in some cases edited and elaborated during the long Kassite stewardship of Babylonian cultural life. Without that stewardship, without the 4 centuries of institutional continuity that kept the scribal tradition alive through the disruptions of the late second millennium, much of what we know about ancient Mesopotamian thought and literature might not have survived to be excavated and decoded. The tablets that George Smith found in Ashurbanipal's library were copies of texts that the Kassite scribes had kept alive through a dark age that destroyed more celebrated civilizations around them. The Kassites are, in this sense, a civilization whose most important contribution was defined by what they prevented from being lost, rather than by what they created anew. History tends to undervalue this kind of achievement, precisely because it is less visible, less dramatic, and less amenable to the kind of narrative that centers on individual genius and decisive action. Brilliance builds, patience preserves, and the things worth preserving are sometimes more important than the brilliance that created them. The river of knowledge that began with the accountants of Uruk and the poets of the Ur-3 period and the scholars of the first Babylonian dynasty did not dry up in the Kassite Dark Age. It ran underground for a while, and then it surfaced again, in a city to the north, in the hands of an empire that was building something the ancient world had never seen. Not a state defined by the river it sat beside, a state defined entirely by its willingness to make everything beyond its borders understand, through whatever means necessary, that the world had a new center. Its name was Assyria, and the way it announced itself to the world was not quiet. Chapter 10. Assyria, the empire that terrorized the ancient world. Walk through the ruins of Nineveh today, and you walk through what was once, at the height of its power in the 7th century BCE, the largest city on earth. Not the largest city in the region, not the largest city in the ancient Near East. By some scholarly estimates, the largest urban settlement in the world at that time, housing a population that various researchers have placed somewhere between 70,000 and 150,000 people, with significant uncertainty in those numbers, given the challenges of estimating ancient urban populations from archaeological evidence alone. What made Nineveh possible was not geography or natural resources, or any particular advantage of soil or climate. What made Nineveh possible was an empire built on a principle that the Assyrian kings pursued with a consistency and a clarity that no previous power in Mesopotamia had matched. The principle was this: the world belongs to those willing and able to take it, and taking it, holding it, and expanding it is not merely a political goal, but a sacred obligation. Understanding Assyria requires holding 2 things simultaneously without letting either one erase the other. The first is that the Assyrian Empire committed organized violence on a scale and with a deliberateness that shocked even the standards of a brutal ancient world. The second is that this same empire produced a library, an intellectual achievement, and a scholarly tradition, without which much of what we know about the ancient world would simply not exist. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. The god Ashur, whose name the city shared, was a deity whose identity was increasingly bound up with the Assyrian state itself, whose favor was expressed through Assyrian military success, and whose demands included the extension of Assyrian power over an ever larger portion of the world. The theology of Assyrian imperial expansion was not a cynical cover for material ambition, though material ambition was certainly present. It was a genuine worldview in which the god Ashur had appointed the Assyrian king as his representative on earth, and had charged him with the mission of bringing the entire world under proper divine order. Cities that resisted were not merely military opponents. They were obstacles to the fulfillment of divine will, and the violence visited upon them was understood, within this framework, as the necessary correction of a cosmic disorder. The deportation policy that characterized Assyrian imperial administration deserves particular attention because it was one of the most consequential administrative innovations in ancient history. Across multiple centuries of campaigns, Assyrian kings deported populations on a massive scale, affecting hundreds of thousands of people in total over the course of the empire's history. It is important to note that this is a cumulative figure across many reigns and many campaigns, not the result of any single event. The deportation of the northern kingdom of Israel by Sargon II in 720 BCE, which removed a substantial portion of the Israelite population, is one of the best documented examples, partly because its consequences generated such extensive subsequent tradition in biblical and Jewish literature. The deportation policy had multiple purposes, operating simultaneously. It removed potentially rebellious populations from their home territories. It relocated skilled craftspeople, agricultural workers, and administrators to parts of the empire where their skills were needed. It disrupted the ethnic and cultural coherence of conquered regions in ways that made sustained, coordinated resistance more difficult. The people deported by the Assyrians were not, as a rule, enslaved in the traditional sense. They were typically settled in specific locations, given land to work, and integrated into the local agricultural or craft economy. Their movement was forced, and their cultural disruption was severe. But the Assyrian system was interested in their productive capacity, not in their degradation for its own sake. This practical orientation does not make the policy less brutal in its human consequences. The loss of homeland, the destruction of community networks, the forced separation from the religious sites that gave life its meaning. These were genuine catastrophes for the populations that experienced them. Understanding the administrative logic behind the policy does not require endorsing it. Now let me take you through the Assyrian kings, not as a list of conquests, but as a series of human moments. Because that is the only way to understand what this empire actually was. There was Tiglath-Pileser III, who came to the throne in 745 BCE after a palace coup. He was a ruler who understood, with unusual clarity, that the weakness of previous Assyrian expansions had been administrative rather than military. He reorganized the provincial system so that governors reported directly to the center rather than building independent power bases. He was not, in the texts that describe him, a figure of particular personal charisma. He was something more useful. He was a man who understood that an empire is a machine, and who spent his reign making the machine work better. There was Sargon II, whose deliberate choice to take the name of the ancient empire builder tells you everything about how seriously he took the weight of the tradition he was inheriting. He built a new capital city called Dur-Sharrukin from scratch, an act of royal ego that also reflected a genuine belief that a great king should leave something permanent. He died in battle, An unusual end for an Assyrian king, and his body was never recovered. Later tradition interpreted this as a sign of divine disfavor. Whether Sargon II believed that himself in his final moments, we cannot know. There was Sennacherib, who destroyed the city of Babylon in 689 BCE in an act so theologically controversial that his own son and successor felt obliged to rebuild the city and explain the destruction away. Sennacherib was a ruler of genuine military ability who conducted campaigns across an enormous geographic range, including the siege of Jerusalem described in both the Assyrian Annals and the Hebrew Bible in accounts that differ in their reported outcome in ways that scholars have discussed extensively. He was also a man capable of ordering the destruction of the most sacred city in the Mesopotamian world, when he decided that the theological complications of leaving it standing were less important than the political message of reducing it to rubble. He understood that his decision would be remembered as either a statement of power or an act of impiety, and he chose power. And then there was Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's son, who rebuilt Babylon and restored the statue of Marduk, reaching the greatest geographic extent of Assyrian power by conquering Egypt in 671 BCE. This was an achievement of extraordinary military ambition, projecting Assyrian power across the Sinai Desert and down the Nile Valley. It was also overextension. Egypt was too distant, too culturally coherent, and too large for the Assyrian administrative system to hold indefinitely. The Egyptians reasserted their independence within a generation. And finally, there was Ashurbanipal. He ruled from approximately 668 to 627 BCE, and he represents, in a single paradoxical personality, the full complexity of what Assyrian civilization was. Ashurbanipal was a scholar king of the first order. In a tradition where royal inscriptions typically emphasized military achievement, Ashurbanipal wrote with evident pride about his scribal education, about his ability to read the difficult cuneiform texts of ancient Sumer and Akkad, about his knowledge of mathematics and divination. He was, by his own account and by the evidence of what he built, genuinely learned in a way that was remarkable for any ruler. The library he assembled at Nineveh was the culmination of a deliberate and systematic project. Ashurbanipal sent agents across the empire to collect texts, to copy tablets in private and temple libraries, to acquire by purchase, or by more forceful means, any text that his scholars told him was worth having. The result was an archive of somewhere between 25,000 and 30,000 tablets containing the canonical literary, scholarly, religious, and technical texts of the Mesopotamian tradition, organized by subject matter and stored in labeled rooms. This was not a vanity project. Ashurbanipal understood that the texts in his library represented the accumulated intellectual achievement of 2,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization. A king who possessed the canonical texts of the tradition possessed, in a meaningful sense, the tradition itself. The man who ordered populations deported and enemies killed in ways calculated to maximize their symbolic humiliation also preserved, in the library that bears his name in modern scholarship, the oldest surviving, long narrative in world literature, the oldest systematic astronomical records, the oldest sophisticated mathematical techniques, the oldest love poetry written in a human hand. Both things were true. The Assyrian Empire that Ashurbanipal inherited was already showing the strains of its size. After his death, the empire unraveled with a speed that surprised everyone watching. The combination of Babylonian revolt under Nabopolassar and military pressure from the Medes, from the Iranian plateau, produced a coalition that the weakened Assyrian state could not resist. Nineveh fell in 612 BCE. The Assyrian heartland was devastated. The cities that had been the centers of Assyrian power were destroyed so thoroughly that within a generation they were being described by travelers as uninhabited ruins. But the library did not entirely disappear with them. The fire that destroyed the palace baked many of the clay tablets harder than they would otherwise have been. They waited under the rubble for 2,400 years, until the excavators found them, until George Smith opened the crates in the British Museum, until the oldest story in the world spoke again across 5,000 years of silence. The empire that had terrorized the ancient world had, in assembling its library, performed an act of preservation whose consequences outlasted everything else it built. That is the paradox at the heart of Ashurbanipal's legacy. The most feared empire of the ancient world is the reason we can still read Gilgamesh. Chapter 11. Neo-Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, and the Last Flowering. In the year 587 BCE, after a siege of roughly 18 months, the walls of Jerusalem finally give way, and the army of Nebuchadnezzar II enters the city. The Temple of Solomon, the religious center of the Israelite world, is burned. The royal family is captured. The leading citizens of the city, its priests, its scribes, its craftspeople, its administrators, are gathered together and marched to Babylon. They will not return for decades. The Babylonian exile, as this deportation became known in Jewish tradition, is one of the most consequential events in the history of religion. During the decades that the exiled Judeans spent in Babylon, they underwent a transformation in their religious self-understanding that produced much of what we recognize as the theological foundation of Judaism, and through Judaism, of Christianity and Islam. Scholars of religious history have argued extensively about the specific mechanisms and the extent of Babylonian influence on the development of biblical literature during this period. And the debate is genuinely complex. What is broadly accepted is that the experience of exile, of living in Babylon and encountering Babylonian culture and cosmology at close range, shaped the theological development of this period in ways that left lasting marks on the tradition. The city that the Judean exiles were marched into was, at that moment, the most magnificent city in the world. Nebuchadnezzar ruled from approximately 605 to 562 BCE, a reign of 43 years, during which he transformed Babylon from a major Mesopotamian city into something that seemed, to everyone who saw it, like the appropriate capital of the known world. The Ishtar Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the inner city of Babylon. He was faced with glazed blue tiles, on which the sacred animals of the Babylonian gods, the dragon of Marduk and the bull of Akkad, were rendered in brilliant yellow and gold against the blue ground. The colors were not merely decorative, they were theological. Blue was the color of heaven, the color associated with the divine realm. And a gate covered in blue tile was a gate that existed simultaneously in the human world and in the divine one. Walking through it, visitors were crossing not just a physical threshold, but a symbolic one. The processional way leading to the Ishtar Gate was lined with glazed brick panels showing a procession of lions, sacred to the goddess Ishtar, marching in relief along both sides of the broad avenue. During the Great New Year festival, the Akkad, the statue of Marduk was carried in procession along this avenue from his temple to the festival house outside the city, an event of enormous religious and political significance in which the entire city participated and which renewed the cosmic order and the king's relationship to the divine for another year. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt the Esagila, the great temple complex of Marduk, on a scale appropriate to the most powerful god in the Babylonian pantheon. He rebuilt the Etemenanki, the great ziggurat of Babylon, which was so large that later tradition, filtered through the Hebrew Bible, remembered it as the Tower of Babel, the monument to human ambition that reached for heaven itself. The Etymonanke's actual dimension, as reconstructed from archaeological evidence and ancient textual descriptions, were impressive by any standard. A square base of roughly 300 feet on each side, rising through multiple stages to a height that ancient sources describe as comparable to its base dimension. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the traditional 7 wonders of the ancient world, present a historiographical problem worth addressing honestly. Ancient sources describe them as an extraordinary construction, a series of terraced gardens rising above the city, watered by a system of pumps drawing water from the Euphrates, planted with trees and flowers in the middle of a Mesopotamian landscape where such vegetation was exotic and precious. They are attributed by some ancient sources to Nebuchadnezzar. The problem is that no Babylonian text has been identified that clearly confirms their existence. The extensive building inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar, which describe his construction projects in considerable detail, do not mention them. No archaeological evidence at Babylon has been identified that clearly corresponds to the structure described by ancient sources. Some scholars, including Stephanie Dalley, have argued that the Hanging Gardens may actually have been located at Nineveh rather than Babylon, associated with Sennacherib's palace, and that the attribution to Babylon represents a later confusion of the tradition. The honest position is that uncertainty remains. What is not uncertain is the magnificence of what was genuinely there. A city that could produce the Ishtar Gate and the processional way and the Etymonanke had no need of legendary additions to justify its reputation. Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns were the engine that funded this building program. He was an exceptionally capable military commander who conducted sustained campaigns across a wide geographic area with a consistency that his predecessors in the Neo-Babylonian dynasty had not achieved. The Neo-Babylonian Empire had been established by Nebuchadnezzar's father, Nabopolassar, the king who had led the coalition that destroyed Nineveh in 612 BCE, the decisive battle that established Neo-Babylonian power over the former Assyrian territories came at Carchemish in 605 BCE, where the Babylonian army under the young Nebuchadnezzar, then still crown prince, defeated a combined Egyptian and Assyrian force. The victory at Carchemish was one of the most consequential battles in ancient Near Eastern history, ending Egyptian ambitions in the Levant and establishing Babylonian dominance over the territories stretching from the Euphrates to the border of Egypt. Nebuchadnezzar became king within weeks of the battle, called back to Babylon by the death of his father. The campaigns against Judah, which culminated in the destruction of Jerusalem and the deportation of its population, were part of a broader effort to bring the Levantine city-states and kingdoms under firm Babylonian control. The Judean exiles who arrived in Babylon maintained their identity, their religious traditions, their language, their community structures, but they also encountered, at close range, a cosmological and literary tradition of extraordinary depth and sophistication. The relationship between Babylonian culture and the development of biblical literature during this period is a subject of extensive scholarly discussion, and the connections that scholars have identified are numerous and structurally significant. The cosmological framework of the opening chapters of Genesis, the genealogies with their gradually diminishing lifespans, the flood narrative, all of these bear relationships to Babylonian literary and mythological traditions that are too structural to be coincidental, while also reflecting theological transformations of such depth and originality that the relationship is one of creative engagement rather than simple borrowing. The Neo-Babylonian period was also intellectually productive in ways that laid the foundations for developments in astronomy and mathematics that would shape the subsequent history of science. Babylonian astronomers were making careful, regular observations of planetary movements, recording them in standardized formats, and developing mathematical techniques for predicting future positions of planets and the dates of astronomical events like eclipses. Nebuchadnezzar died around 562 BCE. His immediate successors were weaker rulers who struggled to maintain the stability his long reign had established. Within 23 years of his death, the empire had passed through 4 kings and was politically fragile in ways that an external challenge would expose decisively. That challenge came in 539 BCE, and it came not from a traditional military rival, but from a new kind of power, led by a ruler whose approach to conquest was so different from anything Mesopotamia had experienced that it changed, at least temporarily, what conquest itself could mean. His name was Cyrus, and the way Babylon received him is where our final chapter begins. Chapter 12. Cyrus, the Fall, and what Mesopotamia left behind. In the British Museum in London, a small clay cylinder sits in a glass case, about 9 inches long, covered in cuneiform text, found in the ruins of Babylon in 1879. It is not an impressive object by the standards of ancient Near Eastern art. It has no carved imagery, no glazed surface, no gold leaf. It is a plain cylinder of baked clay, the kind of object that a busy administrator might easily overlook in a room full of more visually striking artifacts. It is also one of the most politically significant objects ever produced in the ancient world. The text on the cylinder was written in the name of Cyrus II, king of Persia, in the year 539 BCE, shortly after his army entered Babylon, and what the text says, in the careful, formal language of Babylonian royal inscription, is something that no conqueror of Mesopotamia had said before in quite this way. It says that Cyrus came to Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, that Marduk, the great god of Babylon, had looked across the world and found in Cyrus a righteous king capable of maintaining proper divine order, that the previous Babylonian king, Nabonidus, had offended Marduk through his neglect of proper religious observance, that Marduk had therefore chosen Cyrus, a foreign king from outside the Mesopotamian tradition entirely, as his preferred instrument for restoring proper order to his city, and that Cyrus, having entered Babylon in peace, would now rule as a king who respected the religious traditions of the peoples under his authority, who would allow deported populations to return to their homelands, who would restore the cult statues that previous conquerors had carried away from their proper temples. Historians approach this document with the careful skepticism that any royal proclamation requires. The Cyrus cylinder is propaganda. It was written by Babylonian scribes in the service of their new Persian king, designed to present his conquest in the most favorable possible light and to ease the transition from Babylonian to Persian authority by framing it as religious restoration rather than foreign conquest. The claim that Babylon received Cyrus with joy may reflect genuine popular relief at the end of Nabonidus's unpopular reign, or it may be the kind of assertion that victorious rulers have always made about the warmth of their reception. The document tells us how Cyrus wanted to be seen. It tells us somewhat less, certainly, about how events actually unfolded. But even allowing for the propagandistic dimension of the text, something real and historically significant is happening here. A conqueror is presenting himself, and being presented by the scribal tradition of his newly conquered city, in terms that emphasize restraint, respect for local religious tradition, and the welfare of the governed rather than the glory of the conqueror. This is a different model of imperial legitimacy than anything Sargon or Hammurabi or Ashurbanipal had advanced, and its difference is not merely rhetorical. To understand why Babylon fell in 539 BCE without significant military resistance, you need to understand the reign of Nabonidus, the last Neo-Babylonian king. Nabonidus came to the throne in 556 BCE, and his reign was characterized from its beginning by choices that alienated the powerful, priestly, and merchant establishments of Babylon. His personal religious devotion was focused on the moon god Sin rather than Marduk, the official patron of Babylon, and he pursued this devotion with a consistency that disrupted the ritual calendar of the city in ways that the temple institutions found deeply troubling. Most strangely, he left Babylon for approximately 10 years, residing at the oasis city of Tamar in the Arabian desert, while his son Belshazzar governed Babylon in his absence. Whatever the reason for this extended absence, it meant that the great Akitu New Year festival, which required the physical presence of the king to perform the central ritual in which the king took the hand of Marduk and was annually confirmed in his royal authority, could not be properly celebrated for years at a time. For the Babylonian priestly establishment, this was not a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental failure of the king's most basic religious obligation. The king existed, in Babylonian theology, to maintain the proper relationship between the human world and the divine order. A king who absented himself from the rituals that maintained that relationship had, in the most fundamental possible sense, failed to be a king. When Cyrus and his Persian army approached Babylon in 539 BCE, the city's defenders made only limited resistance. Nabonidus was captured but not executed. The temples were not plundered. The population was not massacred or deported. Cyrus presented himself immediately and deliberately in the traditional role of a Babylonian king. He participated in the Akitu festival, performing the rituals that Nabonidus had neglected. He made offerings to Marduk and to the other gods of Babylon. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror imposing an alien order, but as the restorer of the proper order that Nabonidus had disrupted. The practical consequence of this policy for the Jewish exiles in Babylon was the decree recorded in the Hebrew Bible, by which the exiled Judeans were permitted to return to their homeland and to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Whether this decree was issued in exactly the form the biblical text presents, it is debated by scholars, and the relationship between the Cyrus cylinder and the biblical account has been extensively discussed. What is generally accepted is that the Persian policy of allowing deported populations to return to their homelands was real, and that the Jewish return from Babylonian exile was a genuine historical event enabled by that policy. The memory of Cyrus in Jewish tradition is extraordinary. He is described in the book of Isaiah as the Anointed One of God, a title that carries the connotations of divine election. A foreign, non-Jewish king is given, in the Hebrew Bible, a title that places him among the chosen instruments of the God of Israel. The underlying reality is clear enough. Cyrus did something for the exiled Judeans that transformed his image in their tradition from conqueror to liberator, and the tradition remembered it with a generosity toward a foreign ruler that is unusual in any ancient literature. For Mesopotamia itself, the Persian conquest marked the end of indigenous political control over the region. Babylon remained an important city under Persian rule, and later under the rule of Alexander the Great and the Hellenistic kingdoms that followed him. The scribal tradition continued to function in the temples of Babylon for centuries after the Persian conquest, producing astronomical observations, omen texts, and mathematical works that represent some of the most sophisticated achievements of the entire Mesopotamian intellectual tradition. Alexander the Great, who conquered the Persian Empire and entered Babylon in 330 BCE, came with a reverence for the city that reflected the genuine awe it still inspired. He planned to make Babylon the capital of his empire. He commissioned the rebuilding of the Esagila. He consulted the Babylonian astronomers, whose accumulated observations, going back centuries, provided data that Greek astronomy was only beginning to generate independently. He died in Babylon in 323 BCE, at around the age of 32 or 33, before his plans for the city could be realized. The Hellenistic period that followed saw the gradual decline of the cuneiform scribal tradition, as Greek became the language of administration and commerce across the former Persian Empire. The scribal schools that had maintained the Mesopotamian intellectual tradition for 2,000 years contracted. Fewer students learned cuneiform. Fewer new texts were produced. The last dated cuneiform tablet that has been identified was written in 75 CE, a date that places it in the early Roman imperial period, more than 3,000 years after the first accounting tablets of Uruk. For 3,000 years, someone somewhere was pressing marks into clay in the writing system that had begun in the administrative offices of the world's first great city. Then silence. Now sit with what Mesopotamia actually left behind. Not the ruins and the museum collections, though those matter. The ideas, the practices, the specific intellectual achievements that entered the stream of human knowledge and are still flowing through it today. Take your time with this. The written word itself is the most fundamental legacy, not cuneiform specifically, which died with the scribal tradition that maintained it, but the principle of writing, the idea that marks on a surface can carry meaning across time and distance. That knowledge can be stored outside the human body and retrieved by anyone trained to read it. This principle, first realized in the administrative offices of late Uruk period, Mesopotamia, underlies every book, every document, every piece of recorded information in the world today. The specific technologies have changed beyond recognition. The principle has not changed at all. The 60-base number system that Mesopotamian mathematicians developed persists in the way we measure time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Every time anyone looks at a clock or measures an angle, they are using a mathematical convention that originated in the scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia. The system was transmitted through Babylonian astronomy into Greek mathematics, and from there into the scientific and navigational traditions of the modern world. We have been using it for so long that most people have never thought to wonder where it came from. The astronomical tradition of Babylonia represents one of the most direct lines of transmission between ancient Mesopotamia and modern science. When Greek astronomers of the Hellenistic period came into contact with the Babylonian astronomical tradition, they absorbed its observational records, its mathematical techniques, and its catalogue of celestial phenomena. Hipparchus, working in the 2nd century BCE, used Babylonian eclipse records going back centuries to calculate the length of the lunar month with remarkable precision. Ptolemy, whose astronomical synthesis dominated Western science for over 1,000 years, drew extensively on Babylonian data and techniques. The world you can navigate by the stars is a world whose navigation partly runs on Babylonian mathematics. The law code tradition that begins with Ur-Namma and reaches its most famous expression in Hammurabi contributed to the development of the idea that governance should rest on known and publicly available rules rather than on the arbitrary will of the powerful. The concept of codified law, of a written statement of the principles governing social life that any literate person could in theory access and that the ruler was in some sense bound by, was among the ideas that Mesopotamia contributed to the intellectual toolkit of subsequent civilizations. The Epic of Gilgamesh is not merely historically interesting as one of the oldest surviving literary works known to scholarship. It is genuinely good literature by any standard you care to apply. Its exploration of friendship, grief, ambition, mortality, and the relationship between individual greatness and collective responsibility speaks to experiences that human beings in every subsequent era have recognized as their own. Andrew George, whose scholarly edition of the epic is widely regarded as definitive in its field, has observed that the poem asks questions that no subsequent literature has definitively answered, because they are not the kind of questions that admit of definitive answers. What does a person owe to the community that outlasts them? What is the relationship between the things we build and the mortality that makes building them necessary? What does it mean to love someone who will die? These questions were pressed into clay in the 3rd millennium BCE by people who were trying to make sense of their world with the intellectual tools available to them. They are still being asked tonight. They will still be asked as long as human beings build things and love other human beings and know that both the buildings and the loved ones will eventually be gone. The flood story that appears in the epic and that entered the biblical tradition is now part of the imaginative inheritance of billions of people who follow the Abrahamic religions. Every time the story of Noah is told, in any of the hundreds of languages in which it has been translated, in any of the thousands of contexts in which it has been used to explore questions about divine justice and human survival and the relationship between catastrophe and renewal, a story that began in the scribal schools of ancient Mesopotamia is still doing its work. And then there are the questions that Mesopotamia raised but did not answer, the questions it passed on to every subsequent civilization as part of the inheritance that comes with the achievement of complexity. How do you maintain justice in a society stratified by wealth and power? How do you govern a diverse empire of peoples with different languages and different gods without destroying what makes each of them distinctive? How do you prevent the administrative apparatus of the state from becoming more interested in its own perpetuation than in the welfare of the people it was built to serve? These questions were asked in the ziggurat courts of Ur, and in the palace corridors of Nineveh, and in the scribal schools of Kassite Babylon. They were asked by people who knew they could not fully answer them, but who understood that the asking itself was necessary, that a civilization that stopped asking them had given up something essential about what civilization was supposed to be for. They are still being asked. In every legislature and every courtroom and every city council meeting where someone asks whether the rules we have are the rules we should have, whether the power currently held is being used for the purposes that justified its grant, whether the people at the bottom of the system are receiving what the system promised them, the questions that Mesopotamia first articulated are still alive. The clay tablets dried, the cities silenced, the cuneiform script became unreadable, and then was decoded, and then was read by people who could hear. Across 5,000 years of distance. Voices that had never expected to be heard so far from home. They are still speaking. If you know how to listen, you can hear them. Come back to the river. It is still there. The Euphrates, that the woman in our opening was reading at the edge of the darkness, is still moving tonight through the landscape of southern Iraq. Brown with silt. Indifferent to everything that has been built and destroyed along its shores. Let the room settle now. Let the distance between you and the ancient world close a little. The way it does in the quiet hours, when the noise of the present fades and something older becomes audible underneath it. There is a woman kneeling at the edge of the water. It is 6,000 years ago. She does not know that the river she is reading is the beginning of a story that will last longer than any other story human beings have told about themselves. She does not know that the community behind her, the 100 people sleeping in the settlement she is watching over, will become the ancestor. Through a long and branching and sometimes violent chain of transmission, of every city and every legal system and every written word, and every astronomical observation, and every mathematical technique that the human world has developed in the millennia since she knelt here. She knows what she can hear. The water is moving. She reads its movement the way her mother taught her. She feels in the sound and the quality of the current whether the upstream rains have been heavy, whether the levee to the east will need reinforcement before morning, whether the fields on the other side of the embankment are safe for another day. She makes her judgment. She stands. She walks back to tell the others what she found. That act, the act of paying careful attention to the forces shaping your world and bringing what you learn back to the community that needs to know it, is older than writing. It is older than cities. It is the fundamental act from which everything else in this story follows. The scribes of Uruk who first pressed marks into clay were doing the same thing, making the results of careful attention available to a community too large for word of mouth to serve. The astronomers of Babylon, who tracked the movements of planets across decades of careful observation, were doing the same thing, paying attention to forces larger than any individual and building the record of that attention into something the next generation could extend rather than repeat. The authors of the Gilgamesh epic were doing the same thing, paying careful attention to what it actually feels like to lose someone you love and to know that you yourself will die, and making that attention available to every person who would ever read their words. The Kassite scribe, copying a 500-year-old hymn by lamplight, not knowing if anyone would ever read what he was preserving, was doing the same thing, trusting that the act of preservation mattered even without proof that it would. The civilization that grew from the woman at the river was not a story of inevitable progress or of human nature at its best. It was a story of people, specific people in specific circumstances, making choices under pressures that we can partially understand and partially cannot. They built extraordinary things, and they did terrible things, and they asked questions they could not answer, and they left records of all of it, pressed into the clay that their particular river carried down from the mountains and deposited on the flat plain where they chose to stay. The choosing to stay is what I want you to carry with you as the room goes quiet and the sleep comes in. Every generation of people who lived in Mesopotamia could have left. The river was not gentle. The floods were not predictable. The political conditions were frequently violent, and the labor demands of the state were frequently brutal. At multiple points in the 4,000 years of this story, the civilization that had accumulated along these rivers was severely disrupted, sometimes nearly destroyed. People stayed. They rebuilt. They copied the texts of the previous generation and trained the next generation in how to read them. They maintained the irrigation channels that the previous generation had dug. They rebuilt the temples that the previous war had burned. They went back to the river and read it the way their mothers had taught them. The continuity that resulted was not automatic. It was chosen, again and again, by people who decided that what had been built was worth maintaining, that the community they belonged to was worth the effort of its continuation, that the questions their tradition was asking were worth continuing to ask even when the answers remained out of reach. Think of Enheduanna, the first named author in history, writing about grief and faith in a temple in Ur, becoming part of a tradition that would last 5,000 years without knowing that the concept of a named author would one day matter to anyone. Think of the accountant pressing 42,611 fish into a clay tablet, not knowing that this small, precise, entirely unglamorous act was part of a tradition that would teach the human world what it meant to keep a record. Think of Gilgamesh coming home from his long journey with nothing in his hands except the knowledge that the city behind him would outlast him, standing at the wall, understanding, finally, what it meant that the wall was there. That is not a story about failure. That is a story about what it means to be human in a world that does not offer permanence. To build anyway, To love anyway. To press your questions into clay and trust that someone, somewhere, someday, will know how to read them. The river is still moving outside. The woman is still walking back to tell the others what she found at the water's edge. The scribe is still pressing his stylus into clay, in a room lit by oil lamps, in a city that will one day be dust, and will one day be excavated, and will one day speak again to people who did not know they were waiting to hear it. They are all still there, in the darkness, paying attention, bringing what they found back to the rest of us. Sleep well,